take a 5-minute break. Thank you.
The Commission is in recess for 5 minutes. La Commission est levée pour 5 minutes. Order à l'ordre. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay. We have another witness.
Good afternoon, almost evening, Mr. Commissioner. For the commission, our next witness is Minister Dominic LeBlanc.
Oh.
Oui.
Minister LeBlanc, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
J'aimerais jurer sur un document religieux, s'il vous plaît.
On a la Bible, le Coran ou le Torah disponible?
La Bible, s'il vous plaît.
Pour les fins de procès verbal, s'il vous plaît, veuillez indiquer et ensuite appeler votre nom en entier.
Alors, c'est Dominic LeBlanc, D-O-M-I-N-I-C, L-E-B majuscule L-A-N-C.
Jurez-vous que le témoignage que vous allez rendre devant la commission sera la vérité, toute la vérité et rien que la vérité, que Dieu vous mène en aide?
Je le jure.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Good afternoon, Minister.
Good evening.
Good evening, exactly, almost. Juste avant qu'on commence, si vous voulez répondre en français, aucun problème. Il se peut que je vous pose quand même les questions en anglais, mais dans la langue de votre choix.
Je vais répondre surtout en anglais, mais il y aura peut-être des moments où je préférerais répondre en français.
Parfait, même chose, franglais. Okay, we'll just start with a little housekeeping then. You'll recall Minister LeBlanc having sat for an interview with Commission Counsel on September 9th. And, for the record.
Yes, I do, in Vancouver.
Yes, that's right. And following that interview, we prepared, Commission Counsel prepared a summary of that interview, and you've reviewed that summary. Correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you can confirm that it's accurate?
It is.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, just anytime you're nodding or...
Understood. It's better for your record.
Perfect. So for the record, Mr. Clerk, that's WTS 5073. No need to call it up. So, Minister LeBlanc, obviously you're the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and I'll just ask you to start off by describing very briefly what that entails. What is the role of the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, generally speaking?
So I would probably be the Prime Minister's representative, principal representative, in terms of his ongoing relationships with provinces and territories. So it can cover a number of different federal, provincial issues. I would normally be present when the Prime Minister meets other First Ministers. I'm supported by the Privy Council Office, which is the Prime Minister's department. And we would attempt to coordinate across the Government of Canada as best as is possible the federal government's relationship with provinces and territories. Many of the federal legislative measures or policy measures necessarily involve relationships with provinces, so that would be the principal function I would assume for the government.
Okay, and the Commission hasn't called as witnesses anyone from the Intergovernmental Affairs Secretariat. So could you just spend a moment explaining how that works, how you're supported within PCO as opposed to by an external line department?
That's right. So there's a Deputy Minister, Michael Vandergrift, who supports me in the intergovernmental affairs role at Privy Council. He has a small group of people that support him and me as well. And they would have ongoing relationships at the senior officials level with their counterparts in different provinces and territories. And perhaps the unique role of an intergovernmental affairs minister is, I think with the exception of the province of Quebec, many premiers have kept for themselves the role of being intergovernmental affairs minister in their province or territory. So my counterparts in many cases are the premiers, as I say, with the exception of the province of Quebec.
So you're not dealing with another minister, you're dealing with the premier.
Right, in his or her capacity as Intergovernmental Affairs Minister.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, well, as you know, we're here today to talk about the events that led to the Emergencies inquiry, and we have about an hour and change to do so. So we'll take it pretty quickly. But to start off, can you give us an overview of what your involvement was, essentially? What role did you play in the federal government's response to the events of late January, early February?
I was invited by the Privy Council office to, I think, what was one of, if not the first meetings. It was originally a sort of an ad hoc or informal briefing of a small group of ministers on the preparations for the arrival of the convoy. It was before the first weekend of the convoy arrival in Ottawa, and Privy Council office decided to bring a small group of ministers together to bring us up to date on the preparations, including relationships with the House of Commons or the Parliamentary Protective Service. I also sit on the board of internal economy of the House of Commons as one of two ministers that has a role in terms of the security of the parliamentary precinct as well, which was obviously the initial target that people identified on that first weekend. And then I was included in most of, if not all of the subsequent meetings of the Security and Safety and Emergencies Committee of Cabinet. And then ultimately it became the Incident Response Group chaired by the Prime Minister. So I was included in most, if not all of those briefings for ministers. And during that period, I would have ongoing discussions both with my cabinet colleagues that had line responsibilities for a number of these elements, Mr. Mendicino, who you saw earlier today, but the Transport Minister, for example, some cases the Justice Minister. So I would talk to my own cabinet colleagues, principally to ensure that they were engaging with their provincial or territorial counterparts as much as was appropriate in the particular context of whatever issue was before the cabinet. And in some cases, I spoke to premiers directly as well.
Okay, so I think you probably answered this question then, but as you mentioned, that initial group of ministers consisted of, I think, public safety, so Mr. Mendicino, Minister Blair, emergency preparedness, Minister Alghabra, transport, and then you as in your capacity as intergovernmental affairs minister, or was your role sort of a within government coordination role, or?
I wouldn't have described it as a sort of coordination within the government more generally, other than perhaps in terms of the relationship between our government and provinces and territories. The Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor were participating in those meetings. They have sort of horizontally across the government, because of their role at Privy Council office, some of that responsibility with respect to other line departments. But I would often encourage my cabinet colleagues to ensure that they're maintaining active and open conversations with their provincial or territorial counterparts as the circumstances evolved into various parts of the country in the days that followed that initial weekend.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can I ask you to pull up SSM.CAN 50293? So, Minister LeBlanc, this is a document that summarizes the engagements you had with various provincial counterparts, and you'll see it starts on February 10th. We're not going to go through it right now. We are going to go through it. We'll become very familiar with it by the end of this examination. But at this point, I'm just going to sort of highlight the fact that these engagements really started on February 10th. So the convoy arrives on January 28th, 29th, and your engagement specifically start on the 10th. So the role you were playing, if I understand it, prior to the 10th is essentially facilitating or encouraging these communications between your colleagues and their various counterparts in other provinces.
That's accurate. I would not have been engaged in a very active way with first ministers before that date you see on February 10th.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You can pull that one down and pull the following one up. SSM.CAN 406594. So, Minister LeBlanc, given the short time we have, we're skipping a lot of narrative and going to some pretty specific questions that affect your participation and your role in all of this. So you'll just have to bear with me in that. So this is an email, and just scroll down a little bit, Mr. Clerk, that you received from Ralph Goodale on February 6th. And I take it you're familiar and you recall this email?
Oh, absolutely. I had been asked to talk to Mr. Goodale, and I think prepared that email after my conversation with him.
Okay, so that was my first question. How did it come about? So you were asked to speak to him. I think this email is him emailing you.
Following my conversation with him.
Following your conversation with him. Okay, so maybe we'll start with your conversation with him then. Can you tell us about that conversation?
Sure. So Mr. Goodale has been a friend of mine and somebody that I've worked with, obviously, for a long time. He was a public safety minister himself for the first 4 years of our government. He's from the province of Saskatchewan, which is unique in terms of his parliamentary experience in our government. And he had a very broad perspective. He himself is a lawyer. And it was suggested to me that it might be interesting to see how he, from his current position as Canada's High Commissioner in the United Kingdom, but still very much following domestic events clearly, to see what he's thinking and what are his views on the situation as it was evolving in that week of February 5th and 6th. So I had sent him an email and said, can I speak to you at the end of the day, and set up a phone conversation and had a lengthy conversation with him.
Okay. And is the content of that conversation more or less reflected in the email that we're about to read out, or is there anything that you want to say about it before we do?
No, his email to me, which you see, as I say, followed that telephone conversation, and it largely summarizes what he had said to me in the telephone conversation.
Okay, I can appreciate that it was probably a lengthier conversation than what we see here, but we'll just read the summary in the email. So he's sending this to you and he says, see this tweet from Mayor Tory. The point is clear. Toronto and many other cities handled this municipal policing problem in a professional and competent manner. Granted, the volume of the protest in Ottawa was greater and came without as much warning, but the City of Ottawa and the OPS have proven themselves incapable of grappling with this problem. And it is now the duty of the responsible senior authority, i.e. the Public Safety Minister of Ontario, under provincial policing legislation, I'm emphasizing the shouty capitals, to rectify that problem, including taking control, I think it's taking, not talking, if and as necessary. There should not be an unconstitutional leap to pin this on the feds or the RCMP. Federally, under mutual assistance agreements, we can/should provide resources and personnel as requested, but the authority and responsibility rests with the municipality and the province. To this point, they've failed to deliver safety and security to the inhabitants of Ottawa, and those innocent inhabitants include many parts of the Government of Canada. Scrolling down, please, Mr. Clerk. It remains essential to delve deeply into the true genesis of this demonstration and who is controlling and directing it. Stephanie Carvin, I believe is an academic, suggests that it is the work of organized violent right-wing extremists. It may even have US roots. She could be correct. Our intelligence and national security experts must absolutely get to the bottom of this horrific set of events and prepare for the next one. So Mr. Goodale is expressing a few things in this email, but one thing that comes out clearly is that he views this as he sees a policing problem and views a solution as municipal and provincial with a federal overlay. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that would have reflected my conversation on the phone with him, and it's certainly faithful to, I think, what he expressed in that email.
Okay, and what was your take on that at that point, or your reaction to that conversation?
As I said, I think one of the benefits for me in terms of having that conversation with him was his 4 years of experience as our public safety minister. And I thought he put in a very concise way that I may not have appreciated until that conversation with him, the sort of escalating orders of government that have to respond to these situations. So we had seen, obviously, a pretty significant failure of municipal authorities in Ottawa in those weeks that preceded this. And I thought his insights into the responsibility of different orders of government, and not, perhaps because it was the nation's capital, there was a great deal of confusion, certainly in the public conversation, about what's the Government of Canada doing about Wellington Street. But after my conversation with him and having read his subsequent email, I thought he put in a rather concise way his view, his opinion as to the roles of different orders of government.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down now. So one thing we spent a lot of time talking about this morning with Minister Mendicino, so we won't spend a ton of time on it this afternoon or evening, but is engagement with Ontario and specifically and Ontario's role in responding to these events. So as I said, the Commission has heard a lot of evidence about Ontario's role over the past 5 weeks and attempts to essentially draw Ontario into the conversation, into tripartite meetings, into being part of the solution. And it seems that, I'll just try and summarize this, Ontario's position at first may have been, as you sort of just articulated, well, it's Parliament. It's a federal vaccine mandate and it's happening at Parliament, so this is really a federal problem. Is that a fair characterization, do you think, of what Ontario's initial attitude was?
I'm not sure. I can't speak for the government of Ontario or what Premier Ford or his ministers were thinking. But as I said, in the initial arrival of the convoy in Ottawa, the focus was on the nation's capital. As we know, it quickly spread to other cities and other parts of the country, not just in the province of Ontario. But we did as a national government, and my colleagues, I know the Transport Minister, Mr. Mendicino himself, and senior officials of our government, deputy ministers, were engaging in active and ongoing discussions with their Ontario counterparts as the situation in Ottawa was becoming more entrenched to see if every possible provincial regulatory or legislative authority was being brought to bear to try and resolve ultimately not only Ottawa, of course, but Windsor and other places. So I think our government, and I remember those conversations from the Incident Response Group meetings or the Cabinet Security and Safety Committee, there was an ongoing and active effort, both at the level of ministers, but senior officials supporting them, to reach out to provincial jurisdictions where they were seeing some of the sort of sympathy or knock-on effects of the Ottawa occupation to make sure that every available authority was being brought to bear to bring these illegal events to a conclusion.
And I suppose the response that the federal government would have gotten would be varying degrees of success, if we can put it that way.
Yeah, I think that and obviously the inability across the country to use existing provincial and municipal authorities was one of the constant discussions before our government as we led up to the ultimate decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. But I remember from the very beginning an effort to educate ourselves as a government, and Mr. Goodale's email to some extent speaks to that, in terms of the different jurisdictional roles of orders of government. But we quickly understood the importance of collaborating and ensuring that municipal and provincial authorities were very much working with federal agencies that could provide support. And there are a number of federal agencies that were working with their counterparts, of course, but to really use every available remedy to bring these very damaging illegal occupations or blockades to an end.
Okay. And we know that on February 10th, you had a call with Premier Ford. Can you tell us about that call, how it came about? And before you even start, I'll pull up the document for your benefit. There's a readout of it at ssm.nsc.can 50256. So just situating in time, this would be the Ambassador Bridge blockade is in full swing. February 10th is the date of the first IRG, so we're fairly advanced in the events of the time period we're looking at. And scroll down, is that the right document? Okay, yeah, there we go. Readout of Minister LeBlanc's call with Doug Ford tonight. Okay, so what can you tell us about the call that you had with Premier Ford?
So it was on the evening of February 10th. I remember, as you said, it was following that incident response group meeting. I left Ottawa to fly home to Moncton, New Brunswick. And I had been asked to talk to Premier Ford specifically around what we thought were some authorities the province had in the transportation sector around trucking licenses, permits, insurance certificates. I'm certainly not an expert on the precise regulatory authorities around provincial transportation sectors, but there was a belief that the province of Ontario may have a series of instruments or authorities that perhaps hadn't been brought to bear, whether it was in Windsor or in Ottawa. So it was suggested that I could perhaps reach out to Premier Ford. I have a very constructive and cordial relationship with the Premier of Ontario. I texted him to say I was leaving for New Brunswick and would like to chat to him that evening if possible, and would be at home in 2 hours in Moncton. And he told me to call him when I landed. And I remember being at home, it was about 10:30 or 11 in the evening in New Brunswick. He was still at his office at Queen's Park in Toronto. I said I was calling him to talk about what we thought were some additional authorities that the government of Ontario may have that could be brought to bear with the circumstance in Windsor and obviously in Ottawa. And he immediately went to the process that his government was going through, which ultimately led to their declaration of an emergency order the following day. So the conversation quickly evolved into what Premier Ford was planning to do the following day. And frankly, it went well beyond what we were hoping in terms of some trucking or transportation regulatory authorities. He was very much focused on the economic damage to the province of Ontario and to the country. He talked to me about conversations he'd had with the governor of Michigan, the chief executives of some of the big auto companies, representatives of some of the big unions. He was extremely focused on the severe economic damage to Ontario and to the country. He was focused on the reputational damage that this means in terms of foreign investment into our country. And he was very focused on the public safety concerns and the threats of real violence that people were still continuing to advance in Ottawa and in Windsor. So the conversation, he was quite candid with me about his desire to have the Ontario Provincial Police take a greater role in the Windsor context and also in Ottawa. He talked about his frustration that the situation in Ottawa had not been resolved, and his government was very involved and committed to stepping up, including with the Government of Canada, to do what we needed to bring this to a conclusion across the province of Ontario. And I offered, obviously, as had my cabinet colleagues, to provide any federal resources, policing resources, regulatory authorities that the Government of Canada may have to support the plan that he outlined to me in that conversation. And the next day he had a news conference which laid out most of what he told me on that evening conversation.
Okay. Just before we leave the readout, Mr. Clerk, can you scroll down a little bit? There's just one thing I want to ask you about. Minister LeBlanc informed Premier Ford that the Americans will make it clear that anyone convicted will be barred from entering the United States. Can you tell us what that was about and what did or did not happen with that?
So in terms of what happened afterwards, I probably wouldn't have precise information, but whether it was the Canadian Border Services Agency or the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, who had been having conversations with her counterparts in the White House, Jody Thomas had been briefing the Incident Response Group and a number of ministers around the real concerns the Americans had. I know my colleague, the Transport Minister, who I think you'll see tomorrow, had spoken to his counterpart, the Secretary of Transportation in the United States. So in those meetings, the Americans, we were told by our colleagues or senior officials who had conversations with senior American authorities, including, as I say, our Transport Minister who spoke to his American counterpart, that they were prepared to do whatever they could to support our efforts to bring this illegal activity, these border blockades, to an end. And my understanding, and if I said that to the Premier, it's because somebody would have told us that the American authorities were prepared to help us if there were convictions of some of these truck drivers, for example, they would look at what authorities they had in the United States to bar them from entering the United States.
Okay. And Minister, just taking you back, the Minister Algabra's counterpart would be Secretary Buttigieg?
Exactly.
Okay. And we'll hear about that tomorrow, I think. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down and pull up ssm.nsc.can 402947. So, Minister, this is, as it's being pulled up, I think shortly after that call, you reported on it to the PMO. And so this is your text where you're conveying the Premier Ford's position and spoke to Ford. He's going gangbusters on truckers tomorrow, using emergency order, fines, seizing trucks, arrests, suspension of licenses. He's hot to hammer them at a presser tomorrow at 10 a.m. He will introduce legislation to make sure this can't happen again and wants us to work on plan together to secure border/critical infrastructure going forward. He will then do a presser on Monday to diminish public health measures, but tomorrow is hard on enforcing against blockades. Response comes excellent. So is it fair to say that at this point, whatever happened leading up to this, Premier Ford and the federal government are aligned on an approach?
Oh, very much so. And that, I think, probably was a message I would have sent to the Prime Minister's office following that conversation that evening on the 10th of February. And it's certainly faithful to my recollection of that conversation. What I would do is, as I would talk to or exchange messages with the premiers, I would often ensure that Michael Vandergrift, the senior official at Privy Council office, had a readout of the substance of those calls that he could then circulate as well. But that would have been a message I would have sent to the Prime Minister's office. And I certainly agree with your characterization. That evening, I finished the conversation with Premier Ford very reassured that the governments were going to work together to bring this to a conclusion, not just in Windsor, but obviously in Ottawa. And I would think the 10 or 12 days that followed were a proof point that that was the case.
So both of you are going gangbusters?
Hot to hammer at a presser. I think the context was very much a frustration that what we had seen in Ottawa was now dragging into the third weekend. The border blockages, as I said, at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, were having huge economic and reputational damage to our country. And there was an enormous sense of frustration, I think, in both governments, that we needed to bring these illegal blockades and occupations to a safe and proper conclusion. And the 2 weeks prior to this conversation weren't giving any of us a great deal of assurance that that was the outcome that we were going to quickly achieve.
Fair enough. I was defining going gangbusters as being committed to finding a solution.
And that was absolutely the case.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Can you can you pull up ssm.can 50293? So we'll leave Ontario now and move to Alberta. So the next on the list here, February 11th, Premier Kenney communicated with Minister LeBlanc to express concerns that the provinces have been left with the enforcement challenge and that there has been no response to the request for the CAF, that's the Canadian Armed Forces, to help with tow trucks. And in our interview, you clarified that that message was conveyed by text. And Mr. Clerk, now if you can pull up pb.can 401868. Not particularly legible, but Minister LeBlanc, maybe you can confirm that this is the text exchange to which you were referring. Scroll down one page, please, Mr. Clerk. There we go. So this one reads, this is from you it's a chat with Minister Algabra and Minister Mendicino. And so you're reporting, I got these two messages from Jason Kenney last night. Your guy has really screwed the pooch. This technical term, This trucker vax policy is obviously just dumb political theater. Calling them all Nazis hasn't exactly helped. And now the provinces are holding the bag on enforcement. I can't get any heavy equipment from private vendors to move these freaking trucks off the border because the crazies are making death threats. And you guys turned down our request for army equipment to help us because apparently the government of, scroll down please, Canada doesn't really care about the international border being closed. Pensive emoji. But don't worry, the RCMP commander in Alberta just told me proudly that he's secured some psychologists to do a profile assessment on the protesters. I said, that's great news, Deputy Commissioner. Do any of them know how to drive a tow truck? Jay. To which Minister Algabra replies, speaking of bonkers, and you reply, totally. So is that the text exchange that's reported in the summary of engagements?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we're just going to pick apart and understand if this is the second time this text has arisen today. So I just want to pick apart a few statements made there. First of all, when he says your guy has really screwed the pooch, is he referring to the Prime Minister or who's that a reference to?
I didn't ask him. I didn't reply and ask him exactly which guy he was referring to. So I don't think I could speak for Premier Kenney when he sent that message.
Okay. What was your reaction broadly to these texts?
I had developed as a member of Parliament a cordial and rather amicable relationship with Premier Kenney. We had kept in touch on a whole range of issues, so we had a sort of an ongoing conversation on a whole bunch of issues. When I was in Alberta, I would see him from time to time. I knew, and I think we saw Mr. Mendicino talk about that today, that the government of Alberta had considerable concerns around the ability to get tow trucks with respect to the blockage at the border crossing in Coutts, Alberta. And I knew, again, from probably Bill Blair or Marco at incident response group meetings, that the government of Alberta was seeking potentially some military assets to help heavy military tow trucks to move some of these trucks from the border blockage in Coutts. So this text message was the Premier emphatically expressing his frustration, which I think he had shared with other colleagues, including Marco Mendicino.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down and pull up ssm.can 50293 again. Okay, so we've been now through Ontario and we've been with Alberta, and the remainder of this document, Minister, reports on various other engagements you had with provincial premiers all around the time February 12th through 15th. So it's February 12th onwards. And with the assistance, feel free to keep it up. Can you tell us about the various conversations you were having and what you were hearing?
Sure. So you'll see, I think it was the Saturday, February 12th. That was the weekend we were having, I think, daily, almost daily incident response group meetings that the Prime Minister was chairing, in which I was participating. The situation from our perspective was becoming more and more alarming. There were a lot of public discussions of potential pop-up blockades or demonstrations. And I'm going by memory, but a number of provincial legislatures saw demonstrations. There were some in Toronto, some in Quebec City, a number of provincial capitals. There was public discussion of a number of potential border crossings being targeted as well. There was some discussion about a border crossing in Woodstock, New Brunswick with the state of Maine in my home province. There were concerns around the Pacific Gateway border crossing in British Columbia. I know one of the discussions, again, that was reported in the media, or certainly in social media, was a potential sort of sympathy protest at the ferry terminal in North Sydney, which is the main supply route for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, for the island of Newfoundland. So on that Saturday, I wanted to reach out principally to a group of premiers in Atlantic Canada and Premier Horgan in British Columbia, who were seeing some of this activity in sympathy to the occupation that was taking place in Ottawa. I wanted to offer those premiers again, as they knew from their conversations between their senior officials, but I wanted them to hear from me that the Government of Canada was absolutely ready, in as much as we could, to provide any support that they thought would be useful. The RCMP in many of those provinces are also the contract police authority, and some of the premiers had said to me that they were receiving updates from the divisional commanders of the RCMP in their capacity as the contract police of jurisdiction in those provinces. I remember Premier Fury telling me of his real concern around a potential blockage at the ferry terminal in North Sydney. He's a doctor by profession and told me that on that ferry, many medical supplies, drugs, medical equipment is essentially transmitted to Port aux Basques in Newfoundland and then distributed around the province. And if ever there was a blockage of access to that ferry terminal, it's much more than fresh fruits and vegetables in grocery stores in Newfoundland, but it represented a real threat to public safety and security in his province. So I wanted them to know that we were monitoring those situations. We were receiving updates from senior federal officials in the law enforcement community, in the intelligence community, and that if they had any concerns, they could reach out to me. That was the nature of those conversations. And on the Sunday, on February 13th, Premier Horgan, I'm assuming if it was, I would have sent those messages and followed up on the Saturday, the 12th. But if it shows up on the 13th, it's because Premier Horgan probably replied to me on the Sunday, the 13th, to talk to me about some of the concerns we were seeing in the media around the Pacific Gateway border crossing.
Okay. And in any of those conversations, did the notion of invoking emergency legislation come up, either provincial or federal?
No, not in those conversations. It was the conversation with Premier Ford on the 10th where he spoke about the provincial emergency orders. But in those subsequent conversations on that weekend, no, I did not discuss with them the issue of a Federal Emergencies Act invocation.
Okay, and we know that Premier Ford did, in fact, invoke Ontario's emergency legislation on February 11th. Let me see. So you mentioned that Premier Fury was expressing a concern about, and if I can put it this way, there was no identified sort of threat to the supply chain, but he was concerned that that what was happening might spread and affect the supply chain in Newfoundland. Is that right?
That's right. And it was discussed in the public space. If it was Atlantic media, the Nova Scotia media is what in many cases is followed in the neighboring province of New Brunswick. So I was seeing in public discussions the risk or the threat or the discussion of potential attempts to block access to the North Sydney ferry terminal, the Marine Atlantic Ferry. And it reminded me of the vulnerability of 500,000 Canadians on the island of Newfoundland and Labrador in terms of what is their main supply route for things as important as medicines, medical equipment, and so on. And that was the concern the Premier had expressed to me, and sort of saying that he wanted to be reassured that the Government of Canada was ready should that materialize, to do everything we had to do to ensure that his province wouldn't be held hostage in some kind of circumstance there.
And you told him that the federal government would do whatever it could, or do
of
what
course.
it could?
And my conversations with his Atlantic First Minister's counterparts was exactly in that sense. I remember Premier Higgs, as I said, there's a border crossing that was the subject of some discussion in Woodstock, New Brunswick. There were protests, I think, in the city, I'm going by memory, in Halifax. And of course, Premier King, that Confederation Bridge to Prince Edward Island is obviously a critical supply route for that province as well. That's not far from where I live, that bridge. It's a 2-lane bridge, and it wouldn't theoretically take much to create a lot of confusion in accessing that bridge. So there was a heightened concern that I was hearing, both publicly, but from first ministers, from premiers, about what, I think they were seeing what was happening in Windsor, principally, but other points as well, and they were sharing their concerns with us.
Okay. whereas Premier Horgan in BC, if you'll see the middle sort of bullet there, February 13th, he sort of seems to be conveying that from his perspective, things are pretty under control in BC. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down. So again, we're going to skip pretty quickly in the narrative here, given time constraints. But so those consultations, most of the ones we've discussed were the weekend of February 12th and 13th. We know now essentially the chronology of what happened on February 13th. So the IRG meeting in the afternoon, leading to a cabinet meeting in the evening. And the outcome of that cabinet meeting has been described to us by the clerk as the decision was to call a First Minister's meeting to discuss the potential invocation of the Emergencies Act. Is that fair?
Yes, that cabinet meeting, both at the IRG Incident Response Group meeting the Prime Minister chaired earlier in that day on the 13th, and the cabinet meeting, which was quite late in that Sunday evening, the Prime Minister made it very clear to ministers that he had not come to a decision. He was very clear that he had not come to a conclusion around invoking the Emergencies Act, that he was going to hear from premiers the following day. But the discussion was amongst ministers in terms of what are the steps that are necessary to bring these illegal occupations and blockades to an end, and to restore some sense of public confidence, because even if particular activities or blockades were perhaps being resolved, Ottawa certainly wasn't, but there was a concern, as I said, about a spreading effect or what would be the knock-on effect. So he listened to ministers. We were briefed by the senior officials responsible for a number of federal law enforcement agencies, the National Security Advisor, for example, the Commissioner of the RCMP, the Canadian Border Services. Some of the officials I'm sure you've interviewed would have described to ministers their sense of the evolving situation, and then the Prime Minister would have heard from ministers in terms of their views on what was necessary to resolve this.
Okay, and well, you'll be glad to know that given your role as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, I'm going to be focusing on that as opposed to going through all of the inputs that we're seeing. A meeting that takes place at 10 o'clock in the morning on February 14th. And you'll see what's recorded about what Commissioner Lucky says is Lucky did not get Prime Minister briefed on the plan. The plan here being the Ottawa police plan to resolve the situation in Ottawa. And then Prime Minister will be enacting the Emergency Measures Act. So if I take your evidence and some other evidence we've heard so far, that had not been decided at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 14th, that the Prime Minister would invoke the Emergencies Act?
No, it had not been decided at all. I don't know why the Commissioner would have said that. The Prime Minister began the meeting with the premiers at 15 minutes after she said that by saying he had not come to a decision whatsoever. The clerk had not moved the decision memo to him. So that is not an accurate representation whatsoever from my perspective of when the government made the decision.
Okay, and to be fair, these are notes of a meeting, so it's not necessarily what Commissioner Lucky said, but it's what's written down about what she said.
Right, and I'm seeing this for the first time here. But
okay, so but in any event, that does not accord with your recollection of the chronology.
No, that does not reflect at all my understanding and my personal involvement with those decisions on that day on the 14th.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Clerk. You can take that one down. And can you pull up ssm.nsc.can 50625? This is the readout, Minister LeBlanc, of the First Minister's meeting itself. So with the assistance of this, I'd like you to just walk us through it. How did that meeting unfold? How did it take place? Obviously not every detail, but what were the various opinions being conveyed, being expressed, and how were they received?
So I obviously have familiarized myself with this summary of that conversation, and I participated, of course, In that meeting, I made a brief intervention at the front end of that conversation. The Prime Minister began by stressing that he had not come to a decision on whether we should invoke the Federal Emergencies Act. He spoke at length in terms of these measures would not supplant existing provincial authorities. I think later in the conversation there was some discussion about whether command structures of provincial police authorities would change. The Prime Minister wanted to, at the front end of the meeting, make it very clear that these were designed to be complementary measures that provincial and municipal law enforcement authorities could use when they thought they were needed. He was very clear that it should be a proportionate series of measures, proportionate to the real public order emergency that the government was seeing, to the threat to the safety and security of Canadians. And he also made it clear to the premiers at the front end that nothing in the invocation of the Emergencies Act would take away the charter protections that Canadians enjoyed, and that this could be done in a way that was compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can you scroll down to the next page, please? We're just going to go through a few of the views that appear to have been expressed by various participants on the call. So Premier Horgan sees he says the approach sounds measured and practical. We're as susceptible as anyone across the country. But then he says only concern is that these measures would be implemented by the RCMP, which are already fully taxed, and then concern about emboldening those losing public support. People are exhausted but have taken 3 shots, worry that too heavy a hand may embolden others. But then he says, in the end, would support this at this stage. So can you explain to us, in your words, essentially, what Premier Horgan was conveying to you at the meeting?
So my recollection of his intervention, the Prime Minister started on the West Coast and went across the country. Sometimes he started in Newfoundland and Labrador. This time he started in British Columbia. And Premier Horgan reflected or offered a concern that was shared by a number of premiers during that conversation around the potential risk of inflaming or emboldening some of the actors that were already entrenched at various blockades or in the city of Ottawa. He talked about the importance of the proportionality of it, that the measures have to be targeted to the specific threat, but the measures would need to be tailored to bring it to a successful and safe conclusion as quickly as possible. A number of premiers, I think Premier Horgan, it's not reflected in these notes, but a number of premiers expressed their concern for what they saw was happening in the city of Ottawa. That clearly was a source of a lot of national attention. But Premier Horgan, we took Premier Horgan's support to be very important because his province had not been immune from some activity, including some threats to the Pacific border crossing with Washington State.
Scrolling down a little bit more, Mr. Clerk, until we get to Premier Cochrane says at the very last bullet there, would support emergency measures, but would ask for further consultation if decide to bring in the Army. Where does that reference to bringing in the Army come from? Is that something that was discussed actively at the meeting?
No, it wasn't discussed by my recollection until she raised it. One of the confusions that I worried about, and it's reflected in the interview summaries of our conversation in Vancouver, because this was the first time the Emergencies Act was potentially going to be invoked, many people went back to the 1970s context where the legislation had a different name and some of the enforcement was not done by civilian police officers, or some of the physical security presence, I think is a better way to say it, was not only done by civilian police officers. So Premier Cochrane raised it, and the Prime Minister, I think later on in the meeting, made it very clear that having military personnel deployed in an enforcement or security context on the streets in Canada was an absolute last resort, and it was not being contemplated whatsoever in any of the conversations we had in terms of what might be the measures in a potential declaration. So he very quickly, I think, tried to clear up Premier Cochrane's misunderstanding about the role of the military. It was not being considered, and it wasn't a context that the government was looking at.
Okay. And since you raised it, actually, let me ask you this. The misperception of between the Emergencies Act and its predecessor, the War Measures Act, is that something you were picking up a lot over these 3 weeks, over the events of the convoy?
I think so, because this was a unique moment heretofore in Canada where the successor legislation was potentially going to be invoked for a public order emergency. The criteria were different. The protection of the Charter, of course, wasn't present in 1970. So the juridical and constitutional context was different. That's why a previous parliament passed the Emergencies Act some, I guess, 4 decades ago. But we worried about that public misunderstanding. Il n'y a pas de doute qu'au Québec, et les commentaires du premier ministre Legault lors de son intervention plus tard dans les notes que vous avez, étaient, je crois, et ça c'est mon impression, je l'ai partagé avec la ministre Lebel du Québec suite à la discussion des premiers ministres, que c'était pas du tout le même contexte. Il n'y avait aucune autorité fédérale qui allait remplacer une autorité municipale ou provinciale, surtout en ce qui a trait au corps policier. Il demeurait encore une confusion, moi je dirais profonde, quant à l'application de la loi. Et moi, je pensais que c'était important de rassurer le premier ministre du Québec, mais les autres premiers ministres, comme la première ministre des Territoires du Nord-Ouest, que ce n'était pas du tout le cas.
OK, bon, allons-y voir ça, en fait, à la page, at page, sorry, I'm just going to find the page where Monsieur Legault's statements are made. Page 6, please. So, Premier Legault here says, this is in English, but so translated, I imagine, but in Quebec, we are preoccupied by the situation in Ottawa. It is unacceptable, have to do what needs to be done, support for it 100%. What is important to say is that we don't have this type of problem in Quebec. The SQ, that's the Sécurité du Québec, has been able to control the situation so far. We have to be very cautious about moves to inflame. We don't want the Emergencies Act to apply in Quebec. The Emergencies Act must only apply to provinces in agreement with the application of the Act. We don't need it and we don't want it. So are those the remarks that you were referring to?
Ça, c'est fidèle aux commentaires que je me rappelle que le premier ministre Legault avait fait à l'époque.
Ouais.
Lors de cette discussion. Je pense que le premier ministre lui a rassuré et j'ai fait la même chose avec son ministre des Relations canadiennes, Mme Lebel, suite à la rencontre des premiers ministres, qu'une proclamation potentielle n'allait pas remplacer les autorités existantes au Québec ou ailleurs au Canada, que la GRC n'allait pas prendre une autorité policière au Québec qui n'existait pas avant la proclamation. J'ai aussi discuté dans mon cas avec Mme Lebel suite à la rencontre, la situation à Gatineau. Et ultimement, il y a eu l'aide, je crois, des corps policiers de Gatineau et la Sûreté de Québec dans les ententes qui existaient entre les provinces pour partager des ressources policières dans le besoin. Le premier ministre a soulevé l'importance du poste frontalier à la colle et l'importance pour le commerce international. Il y avait possiblement des discussions d'un blocus dans ce sens-là. Mais nous étions d'accord, d'ailleurs, avec le premier ministre Legault, que la situation au Québec, que ce soit dans la ville de Québec ou à Montréal, a été très bien maîtrisée par les autorités locales et provinciales. Ils n'ont pas eu la situation difficile qui s'est implantée à Ottawa. Alors, c'était pour rassurer le premier ministre du Québec que ce n'était pas une question de prendre juridiction dans sa province. Au contraire, c'était d'offrir des outils potentiels dans le cas où les outils seront nécessaires aux autorités provinciales au Québec. On a aussi expliqué que les mesures économiques, qui étaient une des raisons, je crois, importantes dans la décision d'utiliser la loi sur les mesures d'urgence parce que sans la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, ces mesures économiques et financières n'auraient pas été possibles, que le Québec pourra se trouver dans une situation où les autorités policières auraient identifié un compte bancaire ou une autre transaction financière dans la province du Québec qu'il fallait peut-être geler ou qu'il fallait enquêter. Alors, c'était surtout les aspects économiques qui auraient pu avoir une présence dans la province du Québec, mais c'était à ce moment-là hypothétique, mais je l'ai partagé avec Mme Lebel pour essayer d'aider la compréhension de tout le monde de qu'est-ce qui était une situation tout à fait nouvelle devant tous les ordres de gouvernement.
En fait, c'était ma prochaine question parce que l'avis exprimé ici par le premier ministre Legault était aussi exprimé par d'autres, en fait. Si je peux dire, why does it have to apply here? Why in our province? You may be having a problem in Ottawa, you may be having a problem in Ambassador Bridge, but we're not having a problem in, say, Saskatchewan or Manitoba. That was a view expressed by several provinces. And so was any serious thought given to an approach to the Emergencies Act that would be targeted in the sense of where the measures would apply?
Sure, the government considered one option under the Act, and I don't have a complete juridical sense of the different interoperability of different sections of the Emergencies Act, but there is a possibility to invoke it in a geographically specific context. That was determined not to be the appropriate course of action, I think for two reasons. First of all, the concern about the financial measures, which we believed and which law enforcement, senior officials of the finance department believed might be one of the most effective ways to bring this illegal occupation and these blockades to an end, is to choke off the very real supply of money that they were generating in ways that hadn't been contemplated, perhaps when some of this legislation was drafted. So that instrument was seen as one of the effective, and it, in my view, turned out to be quite effective in dissuading other protest activities and bringing to a conclusion, particularly the context in Ottawa. So there was the requirement for a national application of the Act to ensure that those economic and financial measures, if you're a trucker from New Brunswick that's parked on Wellington Street and your bank account is at Les Caisses Populaires Unies in Caraquette, New Brunswick, you shouldn't be able to evade the financial measures that were necessary, in our view, to bring this to a conclusion. And the other very compelling reason from our perspective to have a national application was because the situation was very dynamic and it was very fluid. And it wasn't clear that if the Ambassador Bridge had been and was in the process of being cleared, it wasn't clear that these people wouldn't come back. It wasn't clear that they wouldn't show up in another jurisdiction. There were still threats identified in other provinces. So we thought that the national application, in the event that there was a sympathy or pop-up blockade that was illegal, it would give the law enforcement authorities in those jurisdictions those instruments. But it also had a dissuasive effect. It would have allowed enforcement authorities to designate critical infrastructure to prevent people from bringing children into an illegal protest or illegal occupation. So we think that it had a dissuasive effect in terms of spreading the serious and illegal occupation in Ottawa to other jurisdictions across the country.
So it's really those two branches or those two aims. One, the application of the financial measures, cutting off funding, and two, the preventative or dissuasive effect that in the government's view meant that the act had to apply nationally if it was going to be effective.
That's right. Maybe the second one might be sort of 2A and 2B. There was a dissuasive element, but there was also the preventative element of giving those jurisdictions those tools should they suddenly arise that the ferry terminal to Newfoundland was blocked. We wouldn't have to re-invoke some special measure to allow the authorities in the province of Nova Scotia to have the measures to designate a critical piece of infrastructure and to render illegal an activity that was designed to disrupt the peace in one of those contexts.
Okay, thank you. You can take that document down now, Mr. Clerk, and pull up briefly ssm.nsc.can 403224. And you can scroll down to page 3, please. So, Mr. LeBlanc, as you know, the consultation with the provinces is part and parcel of the Emergencies Act under Section 25. It's an obligation that must be fulfilled before the act can be invoked. So this is what we're looking at right now is the decision note prepared by the clerk of the Privy Council delivered to the Prime Minister on February 14th. And at the bottom of the page here, she talks about the consultation requirement, and she says, on February 14th, 2022, you convened a First Minister's meeting to discuss with the Premiers, seek their views on this scenario and the measures being explored. We can scroll down a bit because we know essentially what was said during the meeting. She resumes now. She summarizes the various opinions that were expressed, and then she says, this First Minister's meeting will meet the requirements for consultation with the provinces under the Emergencies Act, and then follows that with a letter. So I suppose the question to put would be, so this was one First Minister's meeting, and I think it lasted about an hour or something like that, if that's correct. If this meets the consultation requirement, is there anything that wouldn't?
Well, we believe that meeting was an essential part, as you noted, in terms of the decision to invoke the Act. The Prime Minister had not made up his mind whatsoever before that conversation. But a number of discussions between my cabinet colleagues and their counterparts in the provinces and territories, between senior officials of our government, in multilateral fora, and in some cases bilaterally with provincial and territorial officials, informed our government's conclusion that existing provincial municipal authorities were going to be inadequate to bring this to a safe and expeditious conclusion. So this one meeting was the moment where the Prime Minister shared his views on the potential invocation of the Emergencies Act. But as I said, there were ongoing and active bilateral and multilateral conversations at almost every level of our government that were necessary inputs into the government's decision to proceed to the Emergencies Act as the source of final authority or the last resort in terms of concluding this serious threat to Canadian safety and security.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can you take that one down now and pull up ssm.can 50124? So this is the report to Parliament on the consultations, which I assume you're quite familiar with, Minister LeBlanc, and it goes to the point you were just making, I believe, which is, sorry, scroll down a bit, please, Mr. Clerk, so we can just see what it goes. So the first thing that's listed here, well, there's the background, and then a subheading that says engagement. And over the next few pages, we're not going to go through it all. A lot of it we've heard about over the last few weeks, but scroll down. It describes the various engagements that were had at both the political and officials level over the course of the convoy events. Sorry, Mr. Clerk, can you just keep scrolling for a little bit? Scroll down, we see Prime Minister speaking to the Premier, scroll down again, keep scrolling, and then we see on page, I've lost count, consultations on the Emergencies Act with the First Ministers. And this describes the actual consultation with the First Ministers that we've just gone through. So if I take what you're saying, and if I'm not putting it fairly, then please correct me, but the consultation requirement was fulfilled in the clerk's advice and in your view by the First Minister's meeting at which the Premiers were directly consulted about their views on the Emergencies Act, but that was also in some senses informed by discussions that had been had broadly around the topic of how to resolve this problem prior to that.
Exactly. There was a very deep and a pervasive effort on our government's part to engage with provincial officials and ministers, some cases municipal authorities, particularly to canvass that very issue of, are we missing some provincial regulatory authority, some municipal authority that may assist in concluding some of the illegal blockades or occupations, but also get ahead of some of the discussion of other potential flare-ups. So we viewed the consultation as much more than one particular meeting. If you will, that was the conclusion of the consultative effort. But as I said, many ministers and senior officials of our government had been engaged for many weeks with provincial and territorial officials on what collectively we needed to do to manage a situation that was becoming increasingly alarming, was spreading geographically. The risk of violence or public disorder was growing, not diminishing in some cases. So the trend lines were all worrisome, and that was part of the ongoing discussion. The First Minister's meeting was the formal moment where the Prime Minister heard from all the premiers. I think it might be instructive. As I said, he started on the West Coast and went to the East Coast with a trip across the North to hear from the territorial premiers. He did not cut anyone off. There were, unlike your questioning and the commissioner's rules on time limits, there were no time limits on that conversation. He would have stayed on that call for as long as any premier wanted to talk. He cut nobody off. He answered some questions as premiers would ask them, sometimes ministers, David Lametti in particular. So every premier on that call had an unlimited opportunity to share his or her views with the Prime Minister and some ministers. And at the end, he asked if anybody had anything else to add before he concluded by saying he had not made a decision and that he would reflect on what he'd heard, and the governor and council process was engaged later that day.
Thank you. That's helpful. And that actually, Minister, brings us to the end of the questions that I have for you. But before I sit down, I will ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you. It's been a privilege to answer your questions, and it's an opportunity for me that I've never had as a lawyer to participate in something like this. So thank you very much.
Commissioner, those are my questions.
Okay, so now we go to the next phase. Do you want a break before we do that, or just press on?
Mr. Commissioner, you've been at this longer today than I have, so if you're prepared to go on, I am too, but it's entirely up to you.
No problem. We're used to long days here. Okay, convoy organizers, please.
Good evening, Mr. Commissioner. Bathsheba Vandenberg, Co-Counsel for Freedom Corps and protesters. We have no questions for Minister LeBlanc. However, we would like to give 5 minutes of our time to the City of Windsor and 10 minutes to Justice Centre and Democracy Fund. Thank you.
That's a very good development. Okay, so just so I get that right, 5 minutes to Windsor and 10 minutes to the Democracy Fund, JCCF, that's right? Okay. So next is the Government of Saskatchewan, please.
Good evening, Minister. My name is Mike Morris, and I'm counsel for the Government of Saskatchewan.
Good evening.
I'm just going to advise, I'm better in English than I am in French, and my translation's not working, so it will probably work better if we can speak in English when possible, okay?
Happy to do so. My mother was an Anglophone and my father a Francophone, so I'm happy to have our exchange in English.
Okay. Minister, I understand that the Intergovernmental Affairs Secretariat is contained within the Privy Council office, correct?
That's right.
And Michael Vandergrift is the DM of Intergovernmental Affairs, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And I understand he was the DM in January and February of this year as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And there is an FPT, Intergovernmental Affairs Group, correct?
There is. He has an ongoing dialogue with his counterparts in provinces and territories as well.
I expect that group was very active in January and February of this year, particularly with respect to attempting to coordinate COVID-related responses. Is that fair?
That's fair. That group was very busy, as I mentioned earlier, in our necessary and I would think quite effective federal provincial dialogue around the COVID measures. But there were also, in the COVID context, Dr. Tam had her counterparts, the chief public health officers. There were groups of health ministers. So the COVID context was much more than intergovernmental affairs. But they would have played, to your point, an active role in assisting the Privy Council group that works with me, and Mr. Vandergrift in particular, would have played an active role in supporting other federal agencies and officials in their relationships with provincial and territorial counterparts.
Okay, but in spite of that, this particular group that DM Vandergrift led didn't meet with respect to the Emergencies Act until after it was invoked, correct?
That's right. And as for the reasons I shared with your colleague, the Commission Counsel, we thought that if the government was ultimately going to conclude that that was the last resort to bring these illegal occupations and protests and blockades to an end, it was not conducive to have that conversation in a public context. And the fewer meetings where that issue was raised increased the likelihood that we would be able to have that conversation in an appropriate way at the appropriate moment and not have it in the public space for days and weeks ahead of time.
Right. And I'm just going to quote from the interview summary for what DM Vandergrift said. I expect this is exactly as you related it. DM Vandergrift explained that the reason for this was to avoid a leak of the subject matter such that premiers could express their views at the meeting without creating a public expectation around it. That sounds like it accords with what you've just explained, correct?
Absolutely. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. But you would agree with me that the provincial governments would have been better able to prepare for the meeting if they knew what it was going to be about beforehand, would you not?
From my participation in that meeting, none of the first ministers appeared unprepared. And frankly, when the Prime Minister explained the reason for his convening the meeting, none of them expressed surprise. So I didn't detect a level of unpreparedness or surprise in that meeting at all.
Okay. We heard a little bit from Ms. Drouin, Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council last week, and in her view, once it became known that the federal government, was considering using the Emergencies Act, a decision would need to be made very quickly about whether to invoke it or not. Did you share that view as well?
Yes, I shared that view, and I think that view was widely shared in our government. As I said, a protracted public discussion would not have been conducive to an effective use of the act, an effective invocation. And a number of people offered the view that there was a risk of an inflammatory effect, including the government you represent. So long, protracted public conversation perhaps wouldn't have been effective there either.
Well, actually, CSIS offered that view as well, didn't they?
That's right. And the government considered that view, absolutely.
Okay. But you're certainly aware that on February 13th, Minister Blair did, well, I'm aware of two interviews, one with Rosemary Barton and one with Mercedes Stevenson, where he indicated to those people, national media, that the federal government was considering invoking the Emergencies Act. You're aware of that, correct?
I remember those interviews that Sunday. It was that the journalists were asking how, is the government considering every possible option? I'll remind you, it was the third weekend that the city of Ottawa was paralyzed in a way that was, in our view, a significant and serious risk to public safety and security. And Mr. Blair was saying that any responsible government would, at this point in that emergency, look at every available option to bring this to a successful and safe conclusion.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the clerk to pull up a document. It's SSM CAN 402370. And just so you know, Minister, this document is listed as FMM Feb 14 Q&A. So I assume it's Q&As that were prepared for the First Minister's meeting. Were you aware that such things were prepared?
Some of those things are prepared regularly for various meetings. I don't remember seeing this document certainly before the meeting. I looked at it in some of the documents that might have been sent by the Commission, but I certainly didn't see this document before the First Minister's meeting.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that it wasn't prepared for the First Minister's meeting?
No, but I can't speak to which documents were prepared by which officials. I don't have a full recollection of what documents were circulated, but if you tell me that that was a Privy Council or federal government document that was circulated, I'm prepared to take your word for it, but I can't speak to it personally.
Okay. And I just want you to take a look at the first two questions on this Q&A. The first one is, why did you wait so long to act? And the second is, when will this come into effect? Will you agree with me that these Q&As appear to have been drafted as if the decision to invoke the act had already been made by the time of the First Minister's meeting?
No, that I can tell you without hesitation that the decision had not been made. If some communications official is preparing documents for other officials or for political offices, I say, I don't know who prepared these documents or where they were circulated, but there are a series of documents that are prepared for various hypothetical scenarios in the government as part of the routine course of business. So I would not agree with the characterization that that speaks to a decision made.
Okay, or perhaps whoever drafted it may have been mistaken. Is that your view then?
No, maybe they were. I wouldn't have said it that way until you did. Maybe they were. But as I say, this is a normal course of business for communications officials in the government of Canada. That decision was clearly before the cabinet. The cabinet had been, the incident response group and the cabinet had been considering this second track process for a few days. I don't know when this document was produced even, but as that decision was being considered, it would have been normal for communications officials to prepare documents in contemplation of a decision, but it does not confirm a decision. That would not be accurate.
Okay. Sir, Commission Counsel took you to some of the things that were said during the First Minister's meeting. I would like to address some of the things that weren't said during the call. Will you agree with me that there was no discussion about there being an approved operational plan to clear the protest in Ottawa?
That was a discussion that I remember at a number of incident response group meetings or
but not at the First Minister's meeting. That's what I'm interested in, sir.
I don't remember the First Minister's getting into operational policing details in the city of Ottawa. No, I don't.
Okay. And will you agree with me that at that FMM meeting, the federal government did not advise that no police services said they needed additional authorities? Again,
the Prime Minister convened that meeting to hear from premiers. We didn't provide them with detailed briefings on what police authorities had told our cabinet.
Okay. Will you agree with me that there was no discussion of the specific measures that would be included in the emergency economic measures order?
I want to see the document again that your colleague, the Commission Counsel, brought out in terms of the First Minister's meeting. I do know at the very front end of it, my colleague David Lametti explained 6 areas where the government was considering as potential sources of emergency authorities in the declaration, in a potential declaration. But I don't remember the detail that he would have given on particular financial measures. I do know that that was shared with premiers as one of the potential sources of authorities in this declaration.
Okay, I think your counsel can probably take it up with you because they have some time at the end. I have limited time, unfortunately. But would you agree with me that there was no discussion, for example, of how credit unions may be affected by the order or how insurers might be affected by the order? No acknowledgement that there are provincial crown corporations that provide motor vehicle insurance that could be affected by the order. Will you agree with me on those points?
Again, I don't remember the specifics of which financial institutions would or would not be affected, but I do know we shared with First Ministers the very clear option that should there be an invocation of the Emergencies Act, one of the authorities that we would purport to invoke would be a way to immobilize some of the very real financing, which was fueling, and no pun intended, because a lot of it was spent on fuel, I think, was fueling the illegal occupation in the city of Ottawa and some of the blockades at critical border infrastructures as examples.
I think I can probably help out a little bit. The document that Commission Counsel showed you was prepared by the Government of Canada. So I just want you to confirm that you have no reason to believe that it was inaccurate in terms of what it put in or left out in terms of the summary, do you?
I'm not trying to be difficult, but the Commission Counsel put a number of government documents before me. If you're talking about the one at the end where your colleague went through various premiers' comments at the First Minister's meeting, that was an accurate description as I remember that particular conversation at 10:15 on the 14th with the premiers.
And you'll agree with me that several of the premiers, including Premier Moe, expressed concern that invoking the act could inflame circumstances.
Yes, that's accurate.
And in fact, that was similar to a concern that had been raised by CSIS, correct?
That's also correct, yes.
And several of the premiers indicated that demonstrations were being adequately handled with existing authorities, including Premier Moe. Is that fair?
That's fair. Several also indicated concerns in their own jurisdictions, and the Premier of Ontario, as I'm sure you've noted, identified very real gaps. I also thought it was interesting the number of premiers that spoke of the challenge of getting tow trucks to clear, if it was in Coutts, Alberta, or if it was in Windsor. The inability to get heavy lift tow trucks was something that a number of jurisdictions had shared. And that, as you would know, was obviously one of the powers that the Emergencies Act may have provided.
Sir, do you know when the caucus meeting was held on February 14th?
By recollection, I think it was a half an hour or 45-minute call earlier in that morning. As I've thought about this, I didn't keep notes. I listened to that meeting. By memory, it would have been maybe 9 o'clock on the morning of the 14th.
Okay, so it would have been before the First Minister's meeting then?
Again, subject to somebody correcting me, that would be my best recollection, yes.
We know that the Prime Minister did a press conference at 4:30 p.m. on the 14th where he announced that the Emergencies Act was being invoked. Did Cabinet receive any notice that the Prime Minister had made that decision before 4:30 p.m.?
The way the Prime Minister did not convene another Cabinet meeting after the one on the Sunday evening, a number of ministers with operational responsibilities, of course, would have been involved in some of the drafting necessary for the Governor in Council process, which was engaged after the First Minister's meeting and after the Prime Minister received the decision memo forwarded to him by the Clerk of the Privy Council. But there was no formal Cabinet notification that took place once the Prime Minister had come to his decision after the First Minister's meeting, and the Governor in Council process was engaged, which led to the order in Council being issued.
Okay,
Minister,
you're well over your time. I've given you, in fact, an extra 5 minutes. So please, if you could wrap up.
one last question, Commissioner. Minister, how and when did you find out that the Prime Minister had made his decision to invoke the Act?
I was probably consulted during that afternoon, whether it was around the media, the news conference the Prime Minister had at the end of the day, and the Governor and Council process had been engaged. So I was probably notified by somebody in his office that this was a decision as we moved towards the end of the afternoon, and we were getting ready for what would have been the public announcement.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate you answering my questions today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, if I can call on the Canadian Constitution Foundation, please.
Minister LeBlanc. My name is Sujit Chaudhary. I'm counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. So,
Good evening.
good evening. I'd like to pick up on a theme that was being developed by my friend from the government of Saskatchewan. And so the theme I would submit to you is this, that as you know, the Emergencies Act has a number of requirements that has to be met to declare a public order emergency, correct?
That's right.
And so it's one of the questions that we're trying to get at is whether at the First Minister's meeting, the Prime Minister and other members of the cabinet in attendance effectively communicated to the First Ministers why they felt those requirements had been met. So my friend just asked you questions about the availability of other legal options, the so-called policing plan, correct?
The policing plan, you're referring to the City of Ottawa policing plan?
Well, or what Commissioner Loki has put into evidence, that there was, in fact, by the 14th, a policing plan available or ready to be triggered. And my friend, I believe, asked you whether that plan was put to the First Ministers and you weren't sure if it had been or not.
I'd want to see the document. One of the major concerns that the government had is the lack of effective policing plan, particularly in Ottawa, to some extent in Windsor. These things had dragged on now for 2 and 3 weeks, and the policing authorities were not advancing a plan, or more importantly, implementing a plan that would bring these to a conclusion. But the First Minister's meeting didn't discuss operational details of policing plans.
Well, what I'd like to do is pick up on another limb of the legal test for whether a public order emergency can be declared, which is whether there's a threat to national security. And you're aware of that, correct?
Yes.
And so you're aware that under Section 16 of the Emergencies Act, the Governor and Council can only declare a public order emergency if there's a threat to national security.
Yes, and we concluded there was.
You did. And did you provide any type of documentation or explanation to the First Ministers as to the basis for your conclusion that there was a threat to national security?
Again, in terms of documentary evidence, or documentary exchanges, I wasn't privy to those. I do know that deputy ministers of public safety were sharing information, the commissioner of the RCMP, obviously, with various police leaders in other jurisdictions. So there was an ongoing and active exchange of information, as is entirely appropriate, between federal and provincial law enforcement officials. But in terms of whether that particular policing information was shared at the First Minister's table, it was not.
So, Minister, I'd put to you this, that for the consultation requirement to have some substance to it, the federal government is under a duty, I'd ask you, to be as transparent as possible with the First Ministers on that call about why it is taking the exceptional step of triggering the Emergencies Act, correct?
Why we were considering taking the exceptional step. And as I explained to your colleague, the Commission Counsel, those reflections, those considerations were informed by more than 3 weeks of active exchanges between the Government of Canada and provincial and territorial counterparts. So to say that they were not in possession of the intelligence information, the policing information, I don't think is an accurate description. And I know many of the premiers, because they told me, were also being briefed on an active and ongoing basis, in some cases by RCMP commanders in their particular provinces, because the divisional commanders of the RCMP are, of course, contract police in that jurisdiction. And they were having ongoing and active discussions with public safety ministers in those provinces. And in the case of Premier Kenny, he was clearly being updated in considerable detail by the police commanders in the province of Alberta.
Sure. But Minister LeBlanc, I believe you understand that at this point, according to the evidence that we've heard in the commission, there were 2 potential sorts of threat assessments at the center presented in the Privy Council office. The first you're probably aware of is Director Vigneault's assessment, correct? And he'd concluded there was no threat to national security for the purposes of the CSIS Act.
And
You're
that's
aware
a
of
very
that?
significant, yes, for the
yes.
purposes of the CSIS Act. And I think it's important that there not be confusion around which particular section of what act he was referring to.
But as you probably know, last week, the NSIA, Ms. Thomas testified that in her view, there was a threat to national security under the Emergencies Act, correct?
Yes.
But was her view shared with the First Ministers on that call, so that the consultation was more than just providing them with notice?
Well, I don't share your view that the consultation was providing them with notice. The National Security Advisor wasn't briefing the First Ministers on that call. She would regularly update the Cabinet and the Incident Response Group. We benefited from her analysis and that of Director Vigneault as well. But I'm not quibbling with you. The purpose of that consultation was not to have a legal discussion with First Ministers on the test that the Governor and Council was going to apply when and if we made the decision. My colleague David Lametti will be here tomorrow. He'll be able, I'm sure, to speak directly to the legal test that the government was using and concluded when the Governor and Council made the decision. We consulted carefully and listened very carefully to what First Minister said at that meeting and in a series of previous discussions in the preceding weeks as well.
But just to be clear, at the First Minister's meeting, you don't recall if a detailed threat assessment was provided to the premiers?
Again, first of all, that would not have been a secure forum. A telephone conference call is not normally where senior intelligence officials would share detailed threat assessments. So that particular venue would not have been possible or appropriate. But the way that information was shared with provinces and territories is through the ongoing and secure communications between law enforcement officials of the Government of Canada. And those premiers, many of them would talk to us about it, were being updated by their own deputy ministers of public safety or deputy solicitors general in some provinces, or senior police leadership in their province that had the benefit of an open exchange in a secure context with the Canadian intelligence and law enforcement officials that were briefing the Government of Canada.
Minister, I have a couple of minutes left. I want to take you to a different issue, if I may. It's about your conversations with the Government of Quebec and the reservations expressed by Premier Legault and then your subsequent phone call with Minister LeBlanc. And if I understood you correctly, it was your position that the economic emergency measures that were taken had to apply nationally, correct?
Oui, moi j'ai offert à la ministre Lebel, suite à la discussion avec les premiers ministres, que pour que les mesures économiques soient efficaces, il fallait avoir une application nationale, parce que si quelqu'un avait un compte de banque, par exemple à la Caisse populaire au Québec ou à la Banque nationale, ce ne sera pas à l'abri des mesures économiques nécessaires dans notre jugement pour amener ces actes illégaux à une conclusion.
But the same rationale does not apply to the non-economic measures, does it?
Well, it does in the sense that they were preventative. We thought it was important, as I said to your colleague earlier, it wasn't clear that this problem was going to go away or that the people occupying the bridge in Windsor, Ontario weren't going to displace themselves somewhere else. There was an active discussion about risks to other critical infrastructure. So we thought that the national application of those measures, in the case it ultimately was necessary, would have given the local law enforcement authorities the tools, for example, that the City of Ottawa and the Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP used so effectively to bring the occupation in Ottawa to a conclusion.
Mr. LeBlanc, let me end with this question then. But wouldn't it have been an alternative to have offered those non-economic measures to those provinces that wanted them and to enable them to opt in as they wished to? So those provinces who needed and wanted those powers could have gotten them right away, and those that maybe needed them later could have opted in if they needed them.
That wasn't considered as a responsible or realistic option because by enabling all of the local enforcement, law enforcement, and provincial police authorities to have recourse to those powers should they, in their judgment, determine they were necessary, was a more effective and comprehensive way to provide the deterrent effect to not have a particular group of illegal occupiers in one spot displace themselves somewhere else. So we didn't think we should be having governor and council processes every day following that decision. The more effective and responsible way was to enable those authorities in the other jurisdictions to have recourse to that should they, in their judgment, decide it was necessary.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is the Democracy Fund, JCCF.
Good afternoon, Minister.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening. I'm Hatem Kir, Counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. So the first document I'd like to take you to is the one that we've been talking about for a bit now. It's SSM NSC CAN 50625 REL 3001. And so while that's being pulled up, this is the document relating to the First Minister's conference call, as it says right there. And if we could please go to page 2. Yes, there where, do you see under Premier Horgan's third point, he said that local law enforcement was able to manage. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and if we could please go to page 3, if we can go to Premier Kenney's comments. So at the top of his first point, you see there where he said that 15 days ago they had 1,000 trucks doing a rolling protest, but then 900 went home. It was reduced to 100 hardcore who stayed behind. And then just a little bit beyond that, he says they're down to a group of 40 for the past several days. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then do you also see where between the redactions, Premier Horgan informed the ministers at the meeting that they have procured on market for equipment and have drivers in place. So unless an unexpected surprise should open Cootes border crossing today. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
Okay, and then lastly, under the, lastly with respect to Premier Kenney, under the redactions, if we can just scroll down a little bit, it seems that Premier Kenney informed the First Minister's meeting that at a previous meeting he had asked the federal government to stop the vaccine mandate for truckers. He said he doesn't understand the public health rationale given the level of transmission. Truckers are isolated in cabs, do rapid tests, and that, quote, he said he, quote, thought it was an unnecessary provocation, end quote. Premier Kenney informed the First Minister's meeting of that?
Yes, as I said, this is, in my view, an accurate summary of that meeting.
Okay, and then just proceeding on to page 5, Premier Stephenson for Manitoba, under her second point, informed the government that the RCMP were confident that they had the tools in place under provincial law needed at the Emerson border crossing, and they were finalizing plans to open the border, correct?
Yep, that's what it says.
Okay, so all those premiers had informed the federal government that further powers were not needed then in their provinces.
That was their view during that meeting, yes.
Okay, thank you. The next, I'm going to change course a little bit here. If we can please pull up SSM CAN 6094 REL 301. And while that's coming up, we've already heard about how you had a discussion with Premier Ford on February 10th, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if we can please just scroll down to the second email in the chain, which I take it was chronologically the first email. This is a readout of that conversation that you had with Premier Ford?
Yes, that's a summary that my Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Michael Vandergriff, would have circulated to colleagues across the government that you see noted at the top of that email.
Okay, and Mr. Clerk, can we please scroll down to the second page? I want to take you to the final paragraph in the summary. So it says there that the Premier had informed you that on the following Monday, which I take it would be February 14th, he will be announcing plans to relax public health measures. And he said in his view, quote, the public is at a breaking point, end quote. And then he refers to other jurisdictions taking these steps. Do you see that?
Yes.
And I take it that accords with your recollection of the call?
Yes.
Okay, now he refers to other jurisdictions taking steps. Was it your understanding that he was referring to Alberta, who had announced that they were implementing an accelerated removal of COVID restrictions on February 8th?
To be honest, I don't want to mislead you. I would not be able to say which jurisdiction he was referring to. He may have been talking obviously to other provincial premiers, and his officials would have been. They speak actively amongst themselves, as would Dr. Moore, who was his chief public health officer, with their counterparts. So I can't purport to remember the sequence of which jurisdiction was enacting or altering which particular measures.
Okay, so given that they're all talking amongst themselves, he might have actually even been referring to Manitoba, which made a similar announcement the following day, or Saskatchewan, which made an announcement on the same day for Premier Ford had made that plan, right?
Again, I'm taking your word for it. I don't remember the sequence of which province changed what public health posture within their own jurisdiction, but I take your word for it if you have a sequence of provincial public health measures.
Okay, I want to hone in on one point that Premier Ford raised there. He referred to the public being at its breaking point. Would you agree that the Freedom Convoy protest was one expression of that sentiment?
I would think that certainly in the initial days of the convoy, that attracted a great deal of that sentiment. And our government has acknowledged the difficulty that COVID represented for millions of Canadians. We, the Prime Minister, ministers have acknowledged that this has been extremely difficult on many Canadians, on sectors of the economy. We all know the list of very difficult circumstances that the pandemic brought. So we acknowledge that. And certainly as the convoy was taking form and the first day that we saw on Parliament Hill, there were probably a number of lawful protesters that came to express that sentiment. That wasn't the case as the thing dragged on and as it evolved. But in the initial steps, I think that might be a fair characterization that some of the people participating in some of the convoy activities fit in that category. Clearly, some didn't.
But you'd agree as a general principle that generally, the goal of protesters is to be heard by their government on an issue that concerns them?
I'm not sure I'd generalize that across protest movements around the world or across the country. I can't speak to why particular protest movements are formed. One protests because one wants to bring public attention to a particular issue or bring a certain public policy or governmental policy to public attention. But I wouldn't purport to speak for why people show up at protests or organize protests.
Well, you'd agree that that ability to protest is one of the reasons it's protected in our charter is because it's important to that democratic process. It's the voice of, it's one of the ways that people can have a voice. Absolutely.
Lawful and peaceful protest is an essential part of any democracy. And as you said, it's protected constitutionally in Canada.
So you'd agree that the provinces then that were responding to these protests by lifting their restrictions would be an example of protesters being successfully heard, right?
No, I wouldn't speak for why provincial health authorities made those decisions. I have noted on a number of occasions that Premier Ford, in the case of Ontario, referred to following the medical advice from Dr. Moore, his chief public health officer, and other scientists. So no, I wouldn't purport to say, and I certainly don't purport to speak for premiers or their health ministers or their chief public health officers. They can explain why they made particular decisions with respect to their public health measures, but to say that it is in response to a protest, I think is a pretty simplistic analysis that may not be borne out by what a number of them have said publicly.
What they've said publicly, but if we look at Premier Ford's comments in this call, I grant you, he says he has the support of Dr. Moore, but he says that the public is at a breaking point, and so he's going to put in a more aggressive schedule in Ontario. You didn't take him to be referring to taking action in response to the protest?
No, because in that same conversation, he talked about his extreme frustration with the protests and the illegal blockades and the serious multi-billion-dollar damage it was doing to the economy of Ontario. He shared with me the conversations he had with the governor of Michigan. He shared with me the conversations with union leaders, business leaders about the investment climate that this was sending for Ontario. He spoke to me about the very real risk of violence in Ottawa, the illegal occupation of Ottawa. He was not crediting the illegal occupation or blockades with his decision to adjust public health measures. And in fact, he referred to his chief public health officer in that context as well.
He wasn't crediting that decision, but it doesn't mean it wasn't motivating it, right?
Well, Premier Ford is quite an articulate political leader. I can't speak for why he made particular decisions within the sovereign jurisdiction of the government of Ontario. But my frequent conversations with him would lead me to believe that the decisions that he made on the appropriate public health measures, and Ontario was one of the jurisdictions in the country that had at various times amongst the most severe measures. So his government had taken very difficult and very real steps in the fight against the coronavirus, which we thought were very conducive to trying to protect as many citizens of his province as possible. So his leadership with respect to public health measures, from my conversations with him, was not motivated by the illegal blockade that was causing such harm to the economy of Ontario in Windsor, or the completely unacceptable illegal occupation of the city of Ottawa.
Well, let's turn our attention to a different premier. I'm going to ask that we pull up PB Can 40 1846. You've already seen this. I believe that, or at least a different version of this document. And Mr. Clerk, if we can please go to the last page, we're going to have to zoom in on the second screenshot. Perhaps if we can even just zoom in a little bit more, it's okay if the bottom gets cut off. Okay, so apologies for the quality of the screenshot. This is how we received it, but do you see there at the top, it says the date, Friday, February 11th?
I do.
Okay, and then it says there, Dominic, I take it that this was, I think actually it was already in response to Commission Council. This is a message that you sent?
Yeah, this is I had sort of copy pasted a text message that I had received. I'm guessing if it was 7:47 in the morning, I might have received it overnight from Premier Kenny, and I was forwarding it, I think, to my colleagues.
Okay, so the message from Premier Kenny that you were forwarding, which has already been referred to, is that he said the trucker vax policy is obviously just dumb political theater. Calling them Nazis hasn't exactly helped, right?
Those were his words and his message to me.
Right. Now, my question for you, Minister, is was this sentiment ever relayed to Cabinet as a whole?
I was updating my Cabinet colleagues at the Incident Response Group on various discussions with premiers. I would have forwarded that to, I think, I can't see the top of it, but I remember it was Minister Algabra, I think Omar, and probably Marco Mendicino. But I was updating my Cabinet colleagues on those interactions. But so too was Dr. Tam, who was talking to her chief public health officer counterparts. So the sharing of information around the views of provincial governments was much broader than my summarizing for Cabinet colleagues various conversations that I may have had with premiers.
Given, and you know, we did see that Premier Kenny raised a similar statement, though perhaps with different language, at the First Minister's meeting. Did the government consider lifting restrictions as a way to hear what the protesters were asking for?
No, the decisions that we made on public health measures were informed by public health advice from doctors and from scientists. That was always the focal point of our decision-making as a government with respect to these public health measures.
I put it to you that Premier Kenny was right and that the removal of the exemption for truckers that led to this whole protest in the first place was just a political tactic.
Well, it won't surprise you that I don't share that view. And I would also remind you that the United States had a vaccine mandate with respect to truckers that the government of Canada was not able to lift. So there was also a lot of confusion around whether, if ultimately based on medical and scientific advice, we determined that that particular mandate was no longer necessary. If the United States government hadn't lifted that particular measure, it wouldn't have changed much for truckers trying to cross that particular international border, as an example.
Well, what about referring to the protesters as Nazis? I put it to you that that was also a political tactic.
Again, I don't share that view. I didn't agree with the characterization of Premier Kenny. I shared his message with colleagues of mine.
Okay, those are all the questions I have. Thank you. And I believe there's some time left over, so I can pay back yesterday's indulgence with interest.
Okay, thank you. So next is the CCLA, please. Not sure what's going on.
Those words we've heard so many times, Commissioner, you must be on mute.
Yeah, no, not on mute. I think she's, she was here this morning, earlier. Maybe she didn't realize she had time. Or you were so clear that she has no questions. Okay, well, we'll move to the City of Windsor instead. And maybe Commission Council can.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Good evening, Minister LeBlanc. My name is Graham Reeder. I'm counsel for the City of Ottawa.
Good evening.
I want to start off by clearing up some comments you made to my friend for the Canadian Constitutional Foundation about the police operations in Windsor. It was not the case that there was no plan in Windsor, nor did it take weeks to resolve. The evidence before the Commission is that the blockade in Windsor began on February 7th. A preliminary plan was in place. Windsor Police quickly requested public order resources from the OPP and other policing partners. These resources quickly arrived and the plan was further developed when integrated command was set up on the 10th. The plan was actioned on the 12th and 13th, at which point the blockade in Windsor was cleared less than a week after it was established. Just so you misspoke when you suggested the blockade in Windsor had been going on for weeks and there was no plan. Just wanted to clear that up. Thanks.
Is there a question at the end of that?
No, there was not.
It's an odd way to carry out a cross-examination.
I'm happy to ask if that accords with your understanding, Mr. Blanc.
My understanding is that the economic and social disruption in Windsor was enormous, and it had gone on for many days and was a source of international concern at the highest levels in the American administration. We were obviously glad that it was resolved in the way it was resolved, but to have an international border crossing that cost billions of dollars to the Canadian economy and led to considerable reputational damage for Canada as an investment opportunity, we wouldn't describe as a very successful effort, but I certainly share your view that when it was resolved peacefully, it was a very important moment for the country.
I'll ask Mr. Clerk to bring up SSM CAN 0003117. This is a letter from the Prime Minister to Premiers sent after the First Minister's meeting on February the 14th. And if we can go to page 3 under point 6, the letter reads, Our government recognizes the importance of coordinating with provinces, territories, and municipalities to ensure the safety and security of Canadians. Do you agree with the Prime Minister here?
Yes, and he was very clear in the First Minister's meeting and in various discussions across our government that that was the case.
Thank you. Minister Blair and Minister Mendocino both told this commission that there's a responsibility for all three orders of government to communicate and cooperate when responding to an event like the protests earlier this year. Do you agree with them?
Yes.
And we heard from Minister Mendocino today that timely two-way communication between his ministry and the City of Windsor was important in his work at the federal level to respond to the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge. I'll ask Mr. Clerk to bring up SSM CAN 00002253. Although I understand you did not communicate directly with Windsor, were you aware that your senior advisor, Meredith Kaplan-Jameson, communicated with Windsor's Mayor's Chief of Staff, Mr. Teleszewski, during the blockade of the bridge?
Yes, I know that people who work in my office were speaking with officials at the City of Windsor and in the government of Ontario. And I know that my colleague, and he, I'm sure, spoke about it today, but Marco Mendocino spoke, I believe, with the mayor of the City of Windsor as well on a number of occasions.
Ms. Kaplan-Jameson spoke with Mr. Teleszewski the morning of February 8th, the morning after the blockade started in Windsor. She relied on and Ms. Kaplan-Jameson relied on that information she received from Mr. Teleszewski in this briefing note to you on that same day. She talks about Mr. Teleszewski, if we can kind of slowly scroll through to give the minister a chance to see the briefing note. She talks about Mr. Teleszewski's download and highlights information that she characterizes the makeup of the convoy in Windsor, the situation on the ground, the city's key concerns, what next steps the city had already taken, and what the city's next steps were. Are you aware that Mr. Teleszewski continued to share information with Ms. Kaplan-Jameson throughout the blockade?
I can't speak to the number of specific times or the dates when they would have spoken, but I know that she had told me that she had an ongoing discussion with some officials in Windsor, and I know she was sharing that with colleagues in other offices as well. I assume Mr. Mendocino's office and others.
And further to that, Ms. Kaplan-Jameson asked her counterparts in other ministries to invite her to meetings with Ontario counterparts, including municipalities. Is that right? Does that accord with your?
That would be a normal part of her responsibilities in my office, yes.
Okay. And you're familiar with the report to the Houses of Parliament regarding the Emergencies Act consultations?
The report that was tabled per the legislation, yes.
That's right. So let's pull it up. PB Can 00001159. So the report includes details on the federal government's engagement with the provinces, territories, and municipalities and law enforcement. On the first page under engagement. Is it right that it includes details of the federal engagement with the city of Ottawa?
Yes, I had read that as part of what was tabled in Parliament.
It also describes regular engagement with municipal and provincial officials concerning the Ambassador Bridge, including, just to list them out for you, communication between Prime Minister and the Mayor of Windsor, between the Minister of Transport and the Mayor of Windsor, the Office of the President of the Queen's Privy Council and the City of Windsor, the Minister of Emergency Preparedness in the City of Windsor, the Office of the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities, and I believe that's your office, and the City of Windsor. Is that an accurate summary of?
Yes, I believe that to be accurate of the various communications that were taking place.
Now, would you agree that this regular communication with municipal officials was vital to the work of the federal government in responding to the blockades?
It was, and my colleagues with operational responsibilities, my own role in the intergovernmental space is not obviously operational the way would be the public safety minister or the transport minister, but provincial and municipal partners were obviously critical in managing this circumstance. We're always conscious that municipalities operate constitutionally as creatures of provincial legislation. It's not a constitutional order of government, but they have such an important responsibility in managing these public order emergencies that necessarily their officials, their law enforcement officials and so on have open and active conversations, I think, with provincial and certainly federal officials. And that's in everybody's interest in trying to bring the maximum amount of pressure to bear on ending these illegal circumstances in the most efficient and safest way possible.
And this engagement with municipal governments was important enough to the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act that the government included it in the consultation report. Is that right?
Yes, because it was part of our government's conclusion that existing provincial and municipal authorities and resources were not going to be adequate to bring these illegal events to a conclusion. And that's why the Emergencies Act, which is necessarily the last resort in this decision-making process, in our view, became necessary. So to inform ourselves, we had active and ongoing conversations as a national government with these municipal and provincial authorities because everybody was trying to use every existing tool, authority, resource to bring these to a safe and appropriate conclusion. So for us to conclude that it wasn't likely going to work and that it was necessary ultimately for the governor and council to proceed to invocation, this had to be one of the very critical inputs to that process.
Would you agree with me that it's apparent from the protests and the collaborative relationship and two-way communication between the federal government and impacted municipalities that that communication is critical in responding to a multi-jurisdictional event like the ones we experienced earlier this year?
Yes.
And would you agree that the federal government cannot always rely on their provincial partners to facilitate that communication?
again, I want to be careful. As the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, I'm conscious of the constitutional orders of government. You're a lawyer, you'll understand that as well. Some provinces are very jealous of the Government of Canada having, in some contexts, direct relationships with their municipalities. That's not the case in every jurisdiction. And happily, that was not the case with respect to this joint effort, this collective effort, not joint effort, from the different orders of government, as you noted, to try and manage this national public safety emergency.
And the direct communication that you alluded to there, is that particularly important, which in the case, for example, with the Ambassador Bridge, if an event is related to federal critical infrastructure and that borders within a municipality?
Yes, and that was one of the challenges with respect to those international border crossings, which clearly are critical economic infrastructure for the country. The fact that this international border crossing could so effectively be blockaded, largely in the municipal streets of the city of Windsor. One of the challenges was the bridge itself may have a different jurisdictional scope, but access to an international border crossing, in this case, is properly in the municipal streets of the city you represent. So that is exactly why it was important for us to have the appropriate situational awareness as we contemplated what would be the appropriate tools that might assist municipal and provincial authorities in bringing this to a conclusion.
I understand I'm at the end of my time. If I could just ask one final question.
Go ahead.
What are you doing to ensure this cooperation and communication happens, particularly where, if, for example, a provincial partner isn't engaging in the way you would like? So I, as the infrastructure minister, another portfolio that I have responsibility for, have ongoing and active discussions with provinces and municipalities in terms of infrastructure programs. So across the Government of Canada, there are active discussions with municipalities in many different areas of public policy. But, and in something as important as the effective enforcement of measures necessary to bring illegal, very dangerous and damaging illegal activities to an end, we'll continue to work with all the partners necessary to do this. And as I said, from our perspective, the provincial governments understood that the three orders of government had to be involved for this to be effective. And in the vast majority of cases, that was the cooperation that was successfully being used. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Minister LeBlanc. Those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, next to the City of Ottawa, please.
Good evening, Minister LeBlanc. My name is Alyssa Tompkins. I'm one of the council representing the City of Ottawa. I just have a couple questions for you this evening. So I'm going to follow up on a document that Commission Council took you, the email from Ralph Goodell. So if we could bring that up, it's ssm.can.00006594. Oh, good. And if we can just scroll down. So it's really the last sentence of the first paragraph, but we'll start one sentence prior. Granted, the volume of the protest in Ottawa was greater and came without as much warning, but the City of Ottawa and the OPS have proven themselves incapable of grappling with this problem. And I get that's not your statement, it's his, so I'm going to park it. But it's the last sentence. And it is now the duty of the responsible senior authority, i.e. the Public Safety Minister of Ontario, under provincial policing legislation, to rectify that problem, including taking control if and as necessary. So the follow-up question I had was, and my understanding is the Public Safety Minister of Ontario is in fact the Solicitor General of Ontario? Is that your understanding as well?
Again, I can't speak for Mr. Goodale, but that was how I would have interpreted that as well. He was our federal public safety minister, and his counterpart would have properly been the Solicitor General of Ontario. So I assumed, like you, that that's what he was referring to.
Now, all I want to know is, are you aware if anyone from the federal government followed up with Ontario to see if, in fact, they were going to discharge the duty that Mr. Goodale is talking about here?
So I can't speak. I'm not an expert on the statutory application of provincial legislation in Ontario and what those authorities might be under the Ontario Police Services Act. So I have no ability. I received this email from the now High Commissioner of Canada to the United Kingdom, but a former public safety minister, as I said to your colleague, the Commission Counsel. It was not as a result of Mr. Goodale's email to me, but I think it's accurate to say that there was an ongoing and active discussion between many senior officials of our government, many of my cabinet colleagues, the transport minister, the public safety minister, whom you heard from today, with their Ontario counterparts to explore every necessary and possible option to bring these illegal occupations and blockades to a safe and successful conclusion. But what are the precise mechanics in the policing context? I can't speak to that. Perhaps Mr. Mendocino did earlier today, or maybe David Lametti can tomorrow.
No, and I wasn't intending to ask you about that. I was just asking if you were aware of any interactions by your colleagues or by yourself with Ontario along this line.
So yes, I know there was, as I say, a very active and ongoing discussion at many levels of our government. One conversation that we discussed earlier with your colleagues that I had with Premier Ford on the night of February 10th, he spoke to me about his concern around some of the challenges in municipal policing in the city of Ottawa. He spoke to me about the role that he thought the OPP was increasingly going to be playing in support of the necessary public safety measures to clear the city of Ottawa. And obviously, on that evening, the circumstance in Windsor had not been resolved. So Premier Ford spoke to me about his strong belief that the Ontario Provincial Police could and would be a very important source of support. But in terms of what's the right command structure, I can't speak to that. But I do know that there was a very real desire from the Premier, and that view was shared by some of my cabinet colleagues in the updates they would give to the incident response group meetings. Because, as I say, these discussions, if it was Commissioner Lucky, if it was a national security advisor, intelligence advisor, the Prime Minister, there were many and multiple discussions, particularly with the province of Ontario, but not exclusively, around all of these measures, including the appropriate sharing of police resources to try and bring these to a conclusion.
Okay, that's helpful, and that's all I have. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, counsel for former Chief Slowly.
Good evening, Minister. Rebecca Jones for former Chief Slowly. If we can actually pull up the same document, SSM CAN 6594. And Minister, you testified, this is the document that was just up, so as we're pulling it up, you testified that you appreciated Mr. Goodale's, based on his experience, his insights into the roles of the different orders of government, right, when you got this email?
Yes, and him having held the public safety portfolio in our government, I thought might have given him an insight that other colleagues would not have had.
Fair enough. And I just want to ask you about a few other comments in this email that I think you'll agree with me are insights he shared that you did not agree with. So if we can start in the very first paragraph, there's a reference to a tweet by Mayor Tory, and then there's a reference to it being the situation being a municipal policing problem. And I take it that as a minister in a government that has repeatedly referred to this as a national security crisis, you did not agree that this was a municipal policing problem in Ottawa.
He was talking about Toronto and other cities, and I'm thinking off the top of my head of Quebec City. I'm thinking of Fredericton, New Brunswick, or perhaps Toronto, where, and again, I'm going not by some operational experience I have or briefings on how this worked, but if I go on the coverage of the events at the New Brunswick legislature, the Fredericton police appeared to have handled that successfully. Certainly the Quebec City Police with the Sûreté de Québec were seen to have handled it very effectively. And I also remember the City of Toronto, the very real concerns around some potential blockages at the legislature at Queen's Park in Toronto. But as we know, that University Avenue is a critical access to many of the country's best hospitals. So those kind of conversations or potential protests attracted certainly our attention as a national government. And again, without having been briefed on the operational command of which police force did what, to the observer, and Mr. Goodale was observing this from London in the United Kingdom, I would agree with his assessment that in Toronto, it looked like the Toronto police had effectively handled that situation. But what was the role of other police forces? I can't speak to that.
Right. You can't speak to whether you can compare the experience in Toronto to the experience in Ottawa, for example.
Well, clearly you can't, because the experience in Toronto was effectively resolved and didn't lead to a 3-week illegal occupation. So yeah, I would agree with you.
Right. Well, I mean, there are other differences, right, that we see even in Mr. Goodale's email. He refers to the volume of the protest in Ottawa and the amount of notice. Correct?
Yes, I would agree the volume, but it wasn't a surprise that that convoy arrived in the city of Ottawa. There was considerable notice. In fact, people were filming across the country the trucks rolling towards the city.
So, Minister, I'm going to return to my question. Is it your evidence that what happened in the city of Ottawa was a municipal policing problem? That it was not a national problem?
Not at all. That's not my evidence. That's what Mr. Goodale's email would purport to identify.
Right. So let me just go back to my question. My question was, I wanted to know what part of his email you disagreed with. So you disagree that what was happening in Ottawa was a municipal policing problem, because you say, and we all know, that it was a national problem that was happening in Ottawa, right?
It certainly became a national problem when the capital city was paralyzed and occupied illegally for 3 weeks. There was an element in the city of Ottawa, of course, around Parliament Hill and the role of the Parliamentary Protective Service. As I said to your colleague, I have sat for a number of years on the Board of Internal Economy of the House of Commons. The statute requires 2 ministers to be members. I sit there where we talk about parliamentary security. But I wouldn't purport to say that the public order emergency in the city of Ottawa was a municipal problem. If you're asking me to agree with that, I think it was a national problem. All 3 orders of government had to play an effective role in bringing it to a conclusion.
Right. Thank you. And one more point that I hope we can agree on, this one as well, which is that to the extent that Mr. Goodale said that the city of Ottawa and the OPS had proven themselves incapable of grappling with the problem, you didn't agree, I take it, with any suggestion that the city of Ottawa and the OPS had, through any fault of their own, proven themselves incapable, but only that the situation was not at that time being resolved. Is that fair? I
don't have any experience in police operations. So what is the appropriate police response in a particular public order emergency is not something that I feel comfortable saying.
Okay.
If you're asking if the Ottawa Police Service was overwhelmed and was unable in the front end of this occupation to take control and resolve the situation, that to an observer across the country, I think might be a conclusion. But I do agree with your analysis that as the thing became more entrenched, as it attracted perhaps different actors from the initial weekend, as it became a flashpoint and a rallying point for different participants, the level of the public order emergency became much greater than in those initial days that people may have estimated, perhaps with the advantage of hindsight, incorrectly.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Government of Alberta, please.
Good evening, Minister. My name is Stephanie Bose. I'm counsel for the province of Alberta. I just have one area that I'd like to ask you questions on, and that is on your communication with the Premier of Alberta back in February of 2022. And I'll start by asking the clerk to please pull up a summary of your witness interview. The document is WTS 6073. And then if the clerk could please scroll to page 4. We'll just have this up in case you need to refresh your memory, Minister. Now, you were asked by Commission Counsel and by other counsel about a text message that you shared that you were sent by Premier Kennedy. That wasn't the only text message or communication that you had with Premier Kennedy. Is that correct?
That's the one that I remembered and I discussed in my interview with the Commission Counsel, because he was referring to the potential use of military heavy lift tow trucks. It's possible that Premier Kennedy, as we saw earlier in a text message that I had shared with my cabinet colleagues, he had expressed some frustration in terms of the response of some of the RCMP officers with respect to the situation in Coutts.
And just in your witness summary, you indicate that you recalled telling Premier Kennedy that there was a formal process for RFAs that you were not involved in, but that you would speak to Minister Blair or Minister Anand. Do you recall that conversation with Premier Kennedy?
Yes, it would have been an exchange of text messages, and yes, I do recall that. Mr. Kennedy, of course, was himself a Minister of National Defense, so he would have had, more than other premiers, perhaps an insight into that whole request for assistance process.
And at that time, were you aware that province of Alberta had in fact submitted an RFA on February 5th?
I was not until Premier Kennedy indicated to me that they had submitted it. No, I was not. That was being dealt with by my colleagues, Bill Blair, and obviously the Minister of National Defense herself was involved, but I was not. I would not normally be involved unless I was briefed in a meeting, incident response group meeting, in terms of that RFA process.
Okay, and so it's fair to say that in your ministerial role, you don't typically handle RFAs, correct?
That's correct. As I say, I would have been in meetings where my colleagues would have said, we've received or we're expecting to receive. These things are rarely surprises. They're worked on between officials. When the formal request for assistance arrives, there has, in the vast majority of cases, and most of these things you'll appreciate, there has been a massive increase in those requests for assistance in the COVID context.
Yes, we heard evidence about that.
Yeah, so the process is well worn and well known to provincial emergency measures organizations. There's nothing mysterious about this to provincial authorities.
Right, and in indicating that you would speak to either Minister Blair or Minister Anand, do you recall if you did speak to either of those two ministers?
Yeah, I would have, as you saw, I had forwarded a text message to the Transport Minister and the Public Safety Minister, but I would have said to, certainly to Bill Blair, when he was at the incident response group meetings I was at, that Premier Kennedy had reached out to me with respect to the potential use of military heavy lift tow trucks.
All right. And that limited your involvement there to the RFA, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then just one other question. At no point in time prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act did you discuss with the Premier or any other official from Alberta the potential use of the Emergencies Act. Is that correct?
I have no recollection whatsoever of having raised that with any of them before we had that First Minister's call that we discussed earlier this evening.
All right. Thank you, Minister. Those are my only questions this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any news from the CCLA or?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, they've confirmed that they either did not request time, or if they did, they're not proceeding with it. If there is a party that requested time and has not been called, now would be the time to do it in case there was an issue with the sheet.
It's dangerous to say that there's 10 minutes sitting out there.
I'm not necessarily endorsing that. I'm just saying it's a possibility.
To be fair, that is true. If there is a bureaucratic error on our part, which wouldn't be the first, speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, that's great. So, call on the Government of Canada, please.
Good evening. Robert McKinnon for the Government of Canada. I just want to take you to a couple of documents that my friends have taken you to already. So the first one would be the readout with Premier Ford, and that's ssm.can.94. I think it's 7 zeros. And in this particular, well, we can go to the second page for this, but in this call with Premier Ford on February 10th, late in the evening, the email sent at 10:52, so I assume that the call was shortly before that. Is that to your best?
Yes, and that would have been 10:52 in p.m. in Ottawa, which was almost midnight in New Brunswick, where I was when that call had taken place.
Okay.
And I would have, my practice was to, after a call, certainly of that significance, to immediately provide my Deputy Minister at Privy Council for Intergovernmental Affairs, Mr. Vandergrift, with a summary of the call, and he would circulate that to his counterparts as appropriate in the Government of Canada.
Right. And in this call, he's letting you know about Ontario about to issue an order under the Emergency Act?
Yes, the Premier had told me that they were finalizing those measures, and he was announcing them the next day.
And you had mentioned that you had had discussions with Ontario concerning options to deal with the situation. Is that correct?
Yes, the initial part of the conversation and the purported reason why I texted Premier Ford to ask if I could speak with him when I got home in New Brunswick was to explore what we thought were, particularly in the transportation sector, but not exclusively, options that perhaps non-emergency act options, obviously, that might be brought to bear in the context of Windsor and in Ottawa. So this was part of an ongoing effort at every level of our government, and not only with Ontario, but the example you're using was with Ontario, to ensure that we have used every available and possible authority, municipal, federal, provincial, that may assist in resolving these various illegal activities.
And that was late at the end of the day on February 10th even. You were looking at these options apart from the Emergencies Act and talking to provinces. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And as I say, I know there had been that day a discussion around some what we thought were provincial transportation department authorities that may be helpful in the trucking context. And that was the original reason why I reached out to Premier Ford. And as I say, the conversation was quickly overwhelmed by his explaining to me the decisions that his government was in the process of implementing, which led to their invocation of their own measures the next morning.
In fact, if you look at the second last paragraph, second sentence, it says, Minister LeBlanc said that the RCMP is ready to provide whatever resources are needed as long as there's a good plan in place.
That is absolutely accurate. One of the things that struck me at the various incident response group meetings and in briefings from particularly Commissioner Lucky, but not exclusively the Commissioner, because other federal law enforcement officials were providing updates, the head of the Canadian Border Services Agency, the director of CSIS, and others. But police authorities, particularly in our case, the RCMP, the Commissioner of the RCMP, were very concerned about their counterparts in municipal or provincial police organizations having the appropriate operational plan in place that would enable the RCMP to then effect additional resources in a safe and effective way. So that was a subject that Commissioner Lucky brought up often with the incident response group and in various other briefings that I was a party to before the incident response group was stood up by the Prime Minister.
And there's no mention in this email of any reference to the Emergencies Act, the Federal Emergencies Act, only the Ontario one. Is that correct?
That's right. And I did not discuss with the Premier at all the potential invocation federally. We were still canvassing, and you would have seen that in some of the incident response group minutes. The first track one, was still very much on that evening the focus of our efforts, because we recognized that the Emergencies Act, ultimately, if that was the decision, was a decision of last resort. So we were very much actively in pursuit of existing provincial and municipal authorities and federal support that would help them execute those authorities in the most safe and effective way.
When did you, I'm talking about Cabinet, first consider the use of Emergencies Act?
The first time I remember a discussion about the potential invocation or the necessary analysis that might lead the government to conclude that that was the necessary step of last resort was at a meeting earlier in the evening on the 10th of February in Ottawa, an incident response group meeting. And as I say, the briefing by officials was framed in the context of track one, which we had been pursuing since the very beginning of this public order emergency. And track two then became an option or a source of discussion for the government as an option if track one, which was the existing authorities, municipal, federal, and provincial, continued to prove ineffective in resolving these illegal blockades and occupations.
So it was earlier that day then, you said February 10th, that Cabinet first considered. There was an IRG meeting that day. Are you referring to that IRG meeting?
Yes, and I want to be careful. Considered, I'm not sure that would be the way that's the first time Cabinet was briefed by senior officials that they were beginning to look at, and subsequently over the meetings the next day and on the weekend, that became part of the conversation. But the first time it was raised as an option before the government, the invocation was as the second and last resort track, if you will, was on that evening of the 10th of February at the incident response group meeting. You're correct.
Right. We know that there's a chart at the back of the February 12th minutes listing track one and track two options. Do you recall that?
Yes, and I would have recalled that conversation at that meeting as well. I think that was the Saturday. I was physically in Ottawa during those days, and I remember that Saturday meeting.
So would you use the word consider in that context on the 12th for that meeting?
Yes, the cabinet was being briefed by officials and I assume the Minister of Justice. I'm going by memory. I don't have the minutes in front of me. But cabinet colleagues and senior officials were explaining to the government, to the incident response group meeting in that case, what might be the steps necessary and the potential authorities that could be contained should the government decide to proceed to an invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Okay, thank you. Another document my friends took you to, and you made reference to, so I just want to make sure I'm highlighting an area that you referenced in your answer. It's ssm.nsc.can. A number of zeros, 625. It's the First Minister's conference call. And the first page, you made reference in answer to my friend who didn't have this up at the time. You mentioned the first part that certain measures were listed, and he was asking you about certain measures, and you said you thought you recalled it in the first part, and stop there. If you look at Minister Lametti, and you mentioned 6 measures. If you look on the 4th line, it says he highlighted 6 areas where measures can be taken. Do you see that?
Yes.
Are those the measures that you are referring to when you answered a question earlier?
Yes, I was.
All right. And in there, it has 6. I won't read them all out, but it does have a measure that authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services to relieve the impact of blockades. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
My friend asked you for more specificity, but the measure is referred to in there. Is that correct?
The measure is referred to, and again, going by memory, my colleague David Lametti would have explained that one of the concerns we have is the financial support, which was very considerable to these illegal blockades and occupations, and these economic measures were only available should the government decide to invoke the Emergencies Act, and that was when I think it was your colleague representing one of the provincial governments. That was exactly, I'm going by memory. It's getting late, but it's not as late for some of you who've been here all day. But that was exactly what I was referring to. It is accurate to say that Mr. Lametti told First Ministers that there were these economic measures that financial institutions could take to effectively cut off funding of these illegal activities.
All right. On the second page, my friend referred to some premiers referencing the risk of further inflaming the situation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And if you look at the response of, so Premier Horgan, the PM's response, that Premier endorsed the invocation, and then but recognized afterwards, the PM says we would be as proportional and measured as possible, recognize the risk of further inflaming. Also have to show a firmness that comes with this. Do you see that?
Yes.
So had Cabinet recognized this risk, that it could inflame the situation? There was a reference to a CSIS document the day earlier by one of my friends, inflaming the situation, although in that sense, CSIS was referring to the radicalization element. Did you have a comment on recognizing the risk and taking account of any concerns that the premiers had in that area?
So the Prime Minister, in the course of that conversation with First Ministers, acknowledged that the Government of Canada recognized this risk. But that was also part of the discussions we had at the Incident Response Group meetings when we would have received updates from the various federal intelligence and law enforcement officials that were updating those groups of the group of ministers constituted at these various moments. So it is accurate, I think, Mr. McKinnon, to say that the government of Canada and certainly the cabinet considered carefully the risk of further inflaming or the incendiary effect of a potential decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. That was part of the deliberative process that the government considered when we came to the decision that the circumstances were such that it warranted this measure of last resort.
Okay. And on the third page of this same document, there's a reference under Premier Kenney at the end. It's Premier Kenney. You go a little, about 2/3 of the way down, yes. Yeah, that's the last sentence. There's the last line says, "Don't quibble using Emergencies Act, but there are other ways to reduce passions of people." Do you know what that is a reference to?
That was a reference, and I remember listening carefully to that conference call, to that First Minister's meeting. I do remember the Premier of Alberta, then Premier Kenney, saying that he didn't quibble with using the Emergencies Act, but his focus had been on some of the risks, the public safety risks that were very real in Coutts. He had shared with me his concern about the very high potential for violence in Coutts. But I do remember being surprised that the Premier of Alberta did use the phrase that's accurately reflected in that readout of the conversation.
All right, and my last reference in this document is page 10. I think page six, sorry. There were 6 premiers and territorial leaders who had endorsed the invocation in this meeting, it appears, by my count, one of them being Premier Ford. And in this statement from Premier Ford, he says, I'm looking, so it's where it's in a bullet point, third from the last, province does not have tow trucks. Have to negotiate with tow truck drivers. That will change in the future. We'll ensure that OPP have tow trucks. Embarrassing that we can't get the use of tow trucks. You see that?
I do.
And was that communicated by Premier Ford at this meeting?
It very much was. That view was shared, as we've heard previously, by Premier Kenney. Premier Ford had talked to me about that. I think we were all surprised at the extent to which commercial tow truck drivers were reluctant, were intimidated. What the circumstance was, I don't know. I can't speak to that. But with the lawful authorities, in this case in Ontario, were not able to procure a sufficient access to these heavy lift tow trucks to remove some of these large trucks that would have been blocking either the city streets of Ottawa or the bridge in Windsor, or in the case of Alberta, the Coutts-Alberta border crossing. And one of the reasons why ultimately the Governor and Council, the Cabinet, concluded that the Emergencies Act was a necessary and proportionate use of last resort was because it enabled in the Emergencies Act authorities to give local enforcement authorities the ability to compel tow truck operators or tow trucks. I may not be using the precise words, but this was seen as part of the solution to bring these blockades to a conclusion. It was not tenable to say we can't enforce municipal bylaws, criminal code bylaws, because we can't find somebody to tow a truck away from a critical piece of infrastructure as important as the Ambassador Bridge. That seemed untenable, but Premier Ford correctly identified that as a real operational problem, which we viewed the Emergencies Act as being ultimately able to provide some relief.
Right, and that was on February 14th.
This, absolutely, this discussion was at the First Minister's call on the 14th.
Okay. My friends also took you to your witness statement, WTS number of 073. At the very last page. I just want to ask you a question about revocation. So in your last paragraph, you described the revocation aspect. And in the last sentence, it says, he noted that the Prime Minister was insistent both at cabinet meetings and in public that the measures would be very time limited and would be revoked as soon as the situation permitted. Is that still a fair statement?
It is. The Prime Minister, when we began to consider the potential invocation of the Emergencies Act at the Incident Response Group meetings, was very insistent that it be time limited and that it not be used longer than was minimally necessary.
All right. And I just have a couple more points to respond to questions my friends have asked. The Council for the Democracy Fund mentioned on February 8th that Premier Kenney had announced accelerated stages to remove all COVID-19 measures. Do you recall that being referenced, the February 8th?
I do.
Okay. And that on that very day, the first step was to remove the vaccine passport removal, correct? And was there a dispersal as a result of that announcement of healthcare measures of protesters at Coots in the next few days?
That, I'm taking your word for it, Mr. McKinnon. That decision of the government of Alberta was on the 8th of February?
Of 8th, yes.
No, the Coots illegal blockade continued for a number of days after that. And in fact, there were sites, I remember, on the route, on the access to the particular Coots border crossing that were increasingly becoming the source, a magnet for other activities. So to pretend that the vaccine passports to go to a restaurant in Alberta resolve the Coots border crossing would not be an accurate view, in my opinion, of the chronology of those events.
Okay. There was another point that was raised about the Windsor blockade and the fact that it had been cleared. Are you aware, if I could just pull up this document, it's WIN 50932. Are you aware of the injunction at Windsor?
I was aware at our incident response group meetings, officials were briefing us, and that was very much in the public domain and in public media about the injunctive relief that was being sought by authorities in Windsor.
Could you go to page 8, paragraph 47? That's it. That's right. About the notion that all was fine at Windsor, if you just look at the top paragraph there, it mentions that a court decision says that there is a risk that there could continue to be, based on uncontroverted evidence, a return of protesters, so it was necessary to continue. So was the Emergencies Act, to your knowledge, a deterrent that was useful for this state?
In my view, yes, and I think I tried to express to one of your colleagues that if a particular, in the case of the Windsor blockade, it was, as I've said before, extremely damaging economically. It was high risk of public safety concerns. All of that, in our view, was true. But once it was dispersed, it wasn't clear where those people had gone or where they may show up next. So in order to keep that particular border crossing open, there was a level of very significant and sustained police presence required. The injunctive relief, as you noted, continued. There was an issue of potentially spreading too thin police resources. So in our view, the Emergencies Act had a dissuasive and deterrent effect that may make it possible for other particular pieces of critical infrastructure or other municipal streets not to be affected in this way once people understood the financial measures and the local law enforcement authorities had these additional tools to designate certain areas, and your colleagues have spoken about this earlier, as a way to manage potential pop-up or sympathy protests. So simply because the bridge had been reopened did not remove, in our view, the risk of a recurrence, and the heavy police presence that remained, I think, was perhaps a confirmation of that concern.
My last question, my very last question is, are you, because it has to do with the deterrent effect, and I hope my question isn't in that same vein, have that effect, but the...
Maybe my answer needs to be briefer.
This can be brief. I won't take you to it unless it's necessary. In the IRG of February 23rd, there's a reference to the use of pamphlets in Manitoba at the Winnipeg legislature that contained measures that were used, that were handed out to protesters in order to help deter them from coming. Are you aware of that from the IRG from February 23rd?
Yes, we took note of the certain irony that the province of Manitoba said over and over again that this wasn't necessary and need not apply on the territory of Manitoba. But the Winnipeg police force thought that those measures that would have been available to them had they been needed were of sufficient importance that they should use them in a pamphlet that they were giving to demonstrators who I think were in front of the Manitoba legislature. I think it's on Broadway Avenue. But that was a source of real concern, and the Winnipeg police thought that those additional authorities were significant enough that they may be used to perhaps dissuade some of those protesters from entrenching in front of the Manitoba legislature like we saw in the city of Ottawa.
Thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, sir.
Okay, so any reply?
No re-examination, Commissioner.
Okay, well then I think you're now free to have supper.
J'ai pas l'air de quelqu'un qui a manqué beaucoup de repas. Mais
Non, mais quand même, peut-être un petit verre de vin pour célébrer la fin de ton témoignage.
je vais peut-être aller même prendre un cigare avec mon collègue Mendocino. Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Merci de votre présence et de votre témoignage, puis aussi d'avoir accommodé à 7 heures ici parce que...
J'apprécie l'occasion beaucoup et votre travail aussi.
Merci. So we're adjourning until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Longer than today, so.
The commission is adjourned. La commission est adjournée.